Under the suffocating weight of a war that has shattered the dreams of every military doctrine and exposed the weakness of even the most powerful propaganda, Vladimir Putin has reached the brink of strategic helplessness. The summer offensive, which was heralded by state media as a turning point and built on the promise of regaining momentum in eastern Ukraine, collapsed not with a bang but with a whimper. This operation, marketed to the world as a turning point in Putin's long and painful war in Ukraine, has turned into a logistical disaster, a tactical embarrassment, and now a political liability. The long-awaited advance on Sumy, the attempt to encircle Kharkiv, the armored flanking maneuvers in Zaporizhia, none of these brought Moscow the victory it needed. Instead, the number of irreplaceable losses has increased. Supply convoys have ground to a halt, soldiers have mutinied, and trenches are filled with the defeated gazes of those who no longer believe in the war they are being forced to fight. Faced with a military personnel crisis that cannot be resolved through domestic mobilization and fearing that a new wave of conscription would spark public outrage, the Kremlin has made a decision signaling the final stage of collapse: to outsource the war to North Korea. Not just ammunition and drones, but human resources as well. Pyongyang has agreed to send an additional 30,000 soldiers to the Ukrainian front, in addition to the estimated 12,000 already deployed in regions such as Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk. One-third of these 12,000 soldiers had already been rendered ineffective. Now, another 30,000 North Korean soldiers are being sent as fresh reinforcements. However, these are not elite commandos or special units. They are poorly trained, ill-equipped soldiers who are ideologically isolated and whose only qualification for deployment is their obedience. For Putin, this is no longer a strategy, but a violent and tragic deal paid for with lives to gain influence. For Kim Jong-Un, it is an opportunity to convert expendable human resources into ballistic technology, radar systems, and possibly nuclear support. But for the world, it is a terrifying symbol of how far both regimes are willing to go not to win a war, but to delay its outcome. The story of North Korea becoming the Kremlin's latest recruitment office begins with a failure. Since the start of the invasion, Russia has lost an estimated 750,000 combat-ready soldiers. This number includes those killed, permanently wounded, mentally broken, missing, surrendered, and deserted. A large portion of the divisions on the front lines have been rendered ineffective. Prisoners who were once promised amnesty in exchange for going to the front were either killed en masse or turned against their commanders. Attempts to mobilize Russian civilians led to protests, mass migration, and a pool of conscripts unwilling to die for oligarchs. Even the most hardline nationalist units, such as Wagner and Akhmat, have been shattered. And now, the only volunteers are North Korean soldiers whose alternatives are imprisonment or poverty. Kim Jong-Un is stepping in with a different solution. Disposable forces who cannot question their mission, cannot read Western media, and cannot go home when things go wrong. Pyongyang's offer was simple: provide Russia with men and take everything it cannot obtain due to sanctions. What was the result? A new flow of human logistics that crossed every moral boundary. Russia is not taking soldiers from North Korea for the first time. Ukrainian intelligence first reported seeing North Korean personnel assisting with fortifications and logistics in Kursk toward the end of 2024. Within a few months, reports emerged that North Korean troops were directly engaging in combat alongside Russian forces and suffering heavy losses in wars they neither understood nor were prepared for. These reports were later confirmed. Kim continued to send thousands more troops despite growing evidence that the first wave had been largely wiped out. The scale was staggering. 30,000 soldiers were being sent to a war zone that had already decimated Russia's most experienced brigades. But the absurdity did not end there. These North Korean soldiers were not fighting for their homeland or ideological brotherhood. They had been forced into battle under the threat of reprisals against their families, and they had been given false information about the nature of the war they were fighting. Their training was focused on mountain operations, not mechanized trench warfare. North Korean soldiers' command protocols are incompatible with Russian signals. Language barriers are so severe that in one incident, a North Korean unit opened fire on a Russian Chechen Akhmat patrol due to a communication error, killing 8 people. In fact, the presence of these soldiers is causing more problems than they are solving. Logistical conflicts, command confusion, low morale, and yet they keep coming, not because they are needed, but because Putin has no other option. Their integration into Russian units is, at best, a patchwork quilt. Many are given fake documents containing false Russian identities, often claiming they are from Tuva or Buryatia, with papers showing they were drafted domestically. For example, according to a previously reported story, a document found on a soldier who died near Kursk stated that he was a roofer from the village of Bayan Tala and had been conscripted into the 55th Mountain Infantry Regiment. His real name was Lee Dae-haek. The military ID contained incorrect birth dates, inconsistent service periods, and missing official seals. This was a poorly fabricated lie, just like the war itself. However, lies cannot stop artillery fire. As you may recall, while Pyongyang's forces were engaged in combat in the Kursk plains, a HIMARS salvo wiped out a 40-member North Korean unit. Only one had survived. They surrendered immediately. Interviews conducted by Ukrainian intelligence revealed shocking truths. The soldiers had no maps, no air defense systems, and no functioning radios. They had been told they would be assigned to rear logistics, but found themselves on the front lines 72 hours after arrival. Others described sleeping on plastic sheets in muddy trenches, sharing expired food, and being berated by Russian officers who viewed them as worthless and disposable. Then the desertions began. In one particularly striking case, 18 North Korean soldiers abandoned their positions and were captured by Russian FSB agents. The Kremlin tried to cover up the incident, but video evidence emerged online. Even now, Ukrainian psychological operations teams are distributing Korean language brochures and making broadcasts promising safety, return to their country, and asylum to fleeing soldiers. While reactions have been limited so far, they are growing. Some are surrendering out of fear. Some are surrendering out of hunger. And it is reported that several North Korean soldiers have finally realized that the war is a lie and have surrendered in recent days. However, the numbers tell the real story. Since arriving at the front lines, over 4,000 North Korean soldiers have been eliminated in Ukraine. This number exceeds the total annual casualty rate of the Korean People's Army in 2020. Still, Kim continues to send more, because for him, this is not about Russia. It is about missile parts. It is about radar codes. It is about air defense systems and possible S-400 components. South Korean intelligence believes that Pyongyang is receiving guidance systems, access to satellite imagery, and training support for its satellite program in exchange for troops and ammunition. During recent North Korean military parades, missile configurations suspiciously resembling Russian Iskander designs were spotted. This is unlikely to be a coincidence. Meanwhile, Russia remains dependent on North Korea's industrial base for the replenishment of artillery ammunition. More than 12 million 152mm shells were shipped from Pyongyang to Moscow. Analysts believe that North Korean technicians are currently assisting with missile assembly in Russian factories and contributing to Russia's backlog in unmanned aerial vehicle production. However, despite all these material gains, the results on the battlefield remain grim. North Korean soldiers, accustomed to a rigid hierarchy and centralized command structure, are struggling in Ukraine's fluid and decentralized battle zones. They lack initiative, battlefield awareness, and technological proficiency. Most have never encountered electronic warfare. Unmanned aerial vehicles terrify them. Night vision confuses them. Artificial intelligence-powered fire coordination systems are overwhelming them. Ukrainian drones equipped with thermal optics and artificial intelligence targeting systems are regularly striking North Korean patrols that are either tightly grouped or unable to effectively camouflage themselves. In one operation, a Ukrainian unit lured a North Korean unit into a fake safe zone and unleashed FPV drones armed with cluster munitions. They were completely destroyed in less than 11 minutes. Already understaffed Russian officers do not consider North Koreans their equals. They are not provided with supplies, excluded from intelligence briefings, and often sent to the front lines as cannon fodder where casualties are high. This animosity is mutual. It is reported that North Korean soldiers find Russian commanders disorganized, unreliable, and condescending. In some cases, it is reported that entire North Korean units refuse to advance under fire. What was the response? It is claimed that no further news has been received about those soldiers. The war is no longer about ideology or territorial disputes. It is a stage for desperation and betrayal. Nevertheless, both sides remain stubborn. Admitting failure would be the end of Putin's regime. Kim Jong-Un cannot announce a currency that could be traded for improvements his failed state could never achieve on its own. What is the cost? Thousands of dead, uneducated soldiers in a foreign country they never chose to fight in. The most surprising thing is the silence. Neither Russia nor North Korea is acknowledging the scale of this operation. General certificates are being issued to the families of the deceased soldiers. Funeral services are being held in secret. Pyongyang is imposing confidentiality agreements on mourning relatives and threatening those who speak out with sanctions. Russian state media is completely ignoring the issue and instead focusing on anonymous foreign volunteers with no names, ranks, or stories.
Russia was plunged into darkness by a series of explosions in Black Sea cities. Since the beginning of the war, the targets had been oil, production lines, fuel, and logistics routes. That was until the night of July 26. The night before, the Lukoil refinery in Krasnodar had been hit. But Ukraine's target the following night was much bigger. Russia's nerve centers on the battlefield were severed overnight. One of the most critical defense facilities in southern Russia was targeted by a one-way drone attack by Ukraine. Radars were disabled, electronic ears fell silent, and communication with the front lines was cut off in an instant. 2 drones flew in and plunged not only southern Russia, but the entire front line into darkness. It was like a sudden execution. So why did Ukraine target this Russian factory right now? On the night of July 26, Ukraine's target was the signal radio electronic plant in Stavropol Krai, about 500 kilometers from the front line. Ukraine's attack targeted the facility's 2 most valuable sections. The first explosion occurred in a production hangar housing computer numerical control systems and imported high-precision production equipment. This section housed machines primarily from Europe and Asia, used for assembling radar antenna modules and frequency-controlled circuits. Following the attack, a fire broke out at the facility, with flames particularly affecting areas housing high-tech equipment. The second attack targeted an electronics component workshop, where electromechanical devices were assembled and tested. This workshop was responsible for calibrating active jammer systems before they were deployed in the field. For these reasons, Ukraine had targeted the factory for attack. Signal had carried forward the radar engineering tradition of the 1970s Leningrad School under Rostec's post-2014 consolidation under the KRET umbrella. The facility was one of 3 factories producing the subcomponents of electronic warfare platforms such as Krasuka 4, Murmansk BN, Borisoglebska 2, and Repellent 1, which are actively deployed in the field. Among these were gallium nitride-based power amplifiers, wideband jamming modules, phased array antenna patch cards, and high-precision LiDAR detection sensors. The chips calibrated in these workshops were used to create the chemical composition of the jamming cloud deployed by Russian batteries in Donbas to blind HIMARS missiles in mid-air. Ukraine probably used UJ-26 Boba drones to cut this lifeline. The Boba family consists of inexpensive, piston-engine modular warhead-equipped unmanned vehicles with a range of over 1,000 kilometers. Their most striking feature is their use of electro-optical target recognition in the post-home phase while tracking GPS plus INS paths. The system gains immunity to signal interruptions by switching to inertial measurement units when entering Russia's jamming barrier, and to an image library in the terminal phase. The engine noise is so faint that it cannot be distinguished from the idle noise of a car beyond 300 meters, and the radar cross-section is at the level described by aircraft engineers as pencil tip. Older generation batteries, like the S-300V4, struggle to hit this mini-boy cruise missile, which is now fully operational, using the reflexes it receives from below. When the angle deficiency of the S-400 and Panzer groups is added, a tear opens in the umbrella over Stavropol. When it comes to the question of why Russia has not addressed this vulnerability, the answer lies in several layers. The first issue is geographical location. The signal complex is located just east of the city center, in the middle of open fields, right in the heart of the civilian industrial belt. This location was considered an advantage in the past because it allowed the complex to be disguised as a normal factory, which is ideal for a defense facility. But in reality, it means that the batteries cannot be placed close together, making it impossible to detect low-altitude targets with visual scans. The second layer is the lack of personnel. After the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the inland air defense units also entered a crisis of trained operators. 4 Panzer teams withdrawn from Rostov, Voronezh and Belgorod and transferred to Stavropol were still waiting in temporary lodgings on the night of the attack. The third layer is the radar blind spot. The surveillance network in the Caucasus was designed to cover Chechnya's airspace. When the east-west drone corridor extended beyond the Simbirsk-Penza line, it fell outside the early warning range and was only detected by S-400 electronic scans 2 minutes before impact. When asked why the signal factory is so critical, many analysts first think of the Krasukha 4 vehicle family. The wheeled jammers, which were the first request of field commanders to cut the data link of HIMARS munitions on the front line, operate with the main sub-radiators and low-noise power dividers produced here. The Murmansk BN long-range HF jammers, the Moskva 1 passive sensor arrays that disable mobile artillery radars, and the RF cards that make up the Lear 3 Orlan control stations all share the same assembly hall as their common supplier. In short, this facility brings together the Russian military's electronic eyes and ears transmitter receiver sets under one roof. Japanese and German CNC machines installed in Workshop 14 grind super alloy waveguide blocks with micrometer deviation. Industrialists used to say among themselves, if we lose that machine, we'll fall 6 months behind. And now that utopia has turned into a nightmare. It is worth remembering that the factory is dependent on imported parts. For this reason, we believe that the repair time will be 4 to 5 months at best. Field analysts see the initial impact of the attack on spare stocks in the electronic warfare line. According to the Russian army's plan, 9 new Murmansk BN towers were to be deployed to the front by the end of 2025. 4 of these were waiting on the assembly table in Stavropol. If these units have been destroyed, the expansion of the radio jamming network in Sevastopol on the Black Sea coast will be delayed until next year. The Krasukha subsystems in the same hall contained the critical calibrations for 3 pickup adaptations that were scheduled to be sent to Donbass at the beginning of the summer. If the repair time is prolonged, the narrowband jamming capacity that provides protection against artillery fire will be reduced. Such a decline would be felt on the front lines even on the first day of operations, as a 1 or 2 percentage point drop in HIMARS interception rates would result in Ukrainian batteries hitting their targets more frequently. Railway networks in southern Russia are falling one by one. Everything is in flames for 3 nights in a row. First Kamenolomny, then Volgograd, and now Salsk. What's more, these are the main arteries feeding Russia's war effort. Now Ukraine's drone attacks are targeting not just stations but the entire supply backbone. The rails that carry fuel, ammunition and soldiers to the southern front are no longer operational. Locomotives have fallen silent and wagons are stranded mid-journey. If trains come to a halt in the war, can Russia advance on the front lines? On July 29th, Ukrainian attack drones targeted the city of Salsk in the Rostov region. This attack was directed at the Salsk railway station, one of the region's most critical logistics hubs. The targeted train was reported to be carrying military equipment, fuel and lubricants, making this junction vital for fuel and military supply traffic. The UAVs directly struck 2 tank cars and the locomotive of the train. The consequences of the attack were so devastating that they defy description. The moment the UAV hit the station was like an ammunition box exploding. A pillar of flame rose into the sky with the explosion. Black smoke rising from the burning carriages could be seen from miles away. The metal piles on the rails looked like they had melted. The station had been turned into a battlefield. Words alone cannot describe this scene. You have to see it to believe it. That is why we are sharing with you the images recorded by civilians who were at the scene immediately after the attack. But the attack was not limited to the railway. As part of the same operation, an electrical substation in the town of Orlovsky, about 56 kilometers from Salsk, was also targeted. This center supplied power to the railway lines around Salsk. The attack on the transformer station disrupted the power supply not only to the station, but to the entire regional railway line. The loss of electrification caused electric locomotives in the area to come to a halt and triggered chain delays in shipments. As a result of the attack, 18 passenger trains were delayed for over 7 hours. This attack was not an isolated act. It was the third deep strike and run raid carried out in quick succession along the same corridor. On July 27th, the train station in the heart of Novocherkassk was hit, while on July 22nd, the Kamenolomny railway junction was targeted. Ukrainian General Staff spokesman Andriy Kovalenko said, "The ant trail supplying the southern front is now seriously bleeding in terms of ammunition, fuel and evacuation traffic," putting the three attacks in the same category. The Kremlin, however, claimed in its morning bulletin that 74 UAVs had been shot down and tried to downplay the attack. But the railway is the backbone of logistics for Russia, which transports the vast majority of its equipment and supplies by train. The Russian army carries out 70% of its land transport by rail. A glance at the map is enough to understand the strategic importance of the Rostov line. This location is the artery that pumps life into Russia's southern front. Tanks, armored carriers, ammunition shipments, fuel tankers, spare parts trucks, even funeral convoys. All of them pass through this railway network stretching from Donbass to the shores of the Azov Sea. Each machine train carries an average of 800 tons of ammunition, 300,000 liters of diesel fuel, and 17 armored vehicles to northern Donbass every day. Even a 5-hour stoppage at the station means that the depots in Tokmak and Melitopol will approach critical stock levels. Ukraine is relying on drones to achieve this. When it comes to the equipment components of the Ukrainian attack, Deputy Defense Minister Ivan Havriluk mentioned domestically produced one-way UAVs without official confirmation. Looking at the published images, we can see a drone with a wing structure similar to the Boba's body. The Boba family was designed based on the principles of low visibility and long range. Its fuselage is largely made of wood composite materials, which minimizes radar wave reflection. The average radar cross-section is only around 0.03 square meters, which is an extremely small target for modern air defense radars. For example, for the 92N6E radars of the S-400 system, the probability of detecting a target of this size within a 35-kilometer range drops below 50%. In short, you notice the drone target approaching too late. Moreover, Boba is not just passive. It flies intelligently. Its dual navigation system, which operates using a combination of GPS-INS and GPS-out, is resistant to electronic jamming. Thanks to this system, it can fly parallel to tree lines and at very low altitudes, reaching its target outside the radar's field of view. Its ability to carry 90 kilograms of explosives means that even a single vehicle can cause serious damage to important infrastructure. You may be wondering what Russian air defense systems did in the face of this advanced technology. In fact, the much-praised Russian air defense systems did nothing. This is because at that moment, the air defense line around Salsk had serious gaps. The Tor-M2U systems had been moved further south, toward the Crimean connection, due to increasing threats to Ukraine's Kerch and Chongar bridges. There were only a few Panzer S-1 batteries in the region. These systems have 6 launch tubes and can shoot down 2 drones per minute under ideal conditions. But they need a 3-minute gap to reload. This interval was enough for drones arriving in swarms to find their targets. There is more. Not only kinetic defense had collapsed, but electronic defense as well. The Signal Electronic Warfare Factory in Stavropol had previously been severely damaged in a similar Ukrainian attack. This facility was producing new jammer generators and signal jamming modules intended for deployment along the front lines. The halt in production at the facility weakened the electronic warfare protection umbrella in the region. Thus, before the new generation jammers capable of disrupting the Boba drone's GPS signals could reach the front lines, the drones were already in motion. All these factors combined enabled the attack on the Salsk junction in Rostov to succeed with almost no resistance. Ukraine not only acted technically, but also timed its move perfectly and exploited intelligence effectively. And Russia's critical supply backbone in the south has been shaken once again. Moreover, Ukraine achieved this through a low-cost but frequently repeated and exhausting approach. It is technically possible to hit the same target with cruise missiles such as Storm Shadow, but this option is no longer attractive in terms of cost-benefit. A single Storm Shadow missile costs around $2 million, and there are only a limited number of these missiles available. However, when Ukraine struck a railway junction like Solsk with 4 Boba-type UAVs, it achieved the same effect at a total cost of only $100,000 to $120,000. Each of these drones carries a high explosive warhead, weighing between 20 and 30 kilograms. When precision strikes are made on target areas containing ammunition wagons, the resulting fires spread chain reaction style across the entire wagon train. This means that fuel or equipment wagons not directly targeted can also catch fire and even explode. In other words, a single explosion can cause operations at the station to completely collapse within a few minutes. But this tactical choice is not based solely on cost effectiveness. It is also part of a psychological and logistical siege plan. The strategy is very clear: to turn the railway network that brings life to Russia's front lines into a chronically damaged system that has to be constantly repaired. Ukraine's goal is to repeat the cycle of fire, wait for it to be extinguished, allow it to be repaired, strike again, as often as possible. This creates a nerve-wracking, vicious circle that consumes both infrastructure and human resources. Kiev's logistics command has restructured its weekly attack tempo with this in mind. The goal? To strike 6 to 8 critical logistical targets each week. This is not merely an operational plan, but a long-term model of attrition. If such a pace can be sustained, the railway backbone, stretching from Rostov to the southern front, will be rendered inoperable not just 3 days a week, but nearly 1 or 2 days every week. This not only disrupts transportation, but also systematically disrupts the Russian army's fuel, ammunition, and spare parts rotation. The Russian 8th Combined Arms Army, stationed on the Donetsk front, aimed to suppress Ukrainian defenses and gain ground by firing an average of 2,500 artillery shells per day throughout June 2025. This intense fire was particularly decisive in counter-battery warfare. This rhythm forced Ukraine's artillery batteries to frequently change positions, take cover, and use ammunition with caution. But the attacks changed the situation. Ammo shipments to the front were disrupted, and the 8th Army's daily firing rate dropped to 1,800. While this may sound like just a numerical decrease, the psychological and operational impact of this small difference on the battlefield is significant. First, this drop gave Ukraine's artillery a breather. As the frequency of attacks decreased, Ukrainian batteries were able to hold their positions for longer periods of time. Instead of moving, they are now focused on aiming. This directly increases the hit rate. More importantly, Ukraine can now use 155mm GPS-guided ammunition such as Excalibur much more efficiently. Kiev measures Russian fire intensity as a noise level, and, when this intensity decreases, reserves its precision munitions for more effective targets. Expensive, limited-quantity munitions like the Excalibur are now directed solely at critical targets: artillery command centers, ammunition depots, armored vehicle clusters, or radar systems. This allows the Ukrainian army to conserve ammunition and increase its effectiveness. This economy of ammunition is also changing the behavior of Russian defense forces. Previously, heavy fire on a specific point of the front line was a signal for Russian troops to move. But now that pressure has eased. Artillery support is delayed, suppression fire is weak, and this slows down position changes. Especially when execution fire is lacking, Russian units hesitate to launch an attack. These delays, based on morale and time, enable the Ukrainian defense to regain the initiative. It should not be forgotten that such attacks target not just a single railway line, but a multi-layered supply chain. The disruption originating from the Salsk node has spread not just to one region, but across the entire southern front. According to the Rostov Logistics Directorate's report, dated July 29th, 4 separate container routes arriving via Novocherkassk have been cancelled. This means that 36 40-ton cargo containers are stranded on the tracks. What's inside? According to the cargo manifests, thermal scopes, waterproof pallets, and 125mm tank shells. On the same day, a 12-carriage convoy departing from Volgodonsk was stranded on the tracks near Ilista for 3 hours due to a signal failure. Satellite data showed that at least 5 fuel tankers were parked on side tracks along the same route for security reasons. Diesel fuel bound for Crimea powers not only tanks, but also generators, port cranes, and refrigerated logistics chains. When this flow is cut off, it is not only engines that stop, but entire systems. According to an analysis by Polymology Positions, every time the interruption is prolonged, it is not only the military wing that is disrupted, but also the wheels of civilian production. When refinery shipments from Rostov were delayed by 1 day, 4 different gas stations along the Tavrida highway reported nothing. Cashiers were issuing receipts, but the pumps were not working. This is not just a logistical war, but a war of perception. Of the 110,000 barrels flowing through, 40,000 are marked as the Army's secret reserve. Its halt means a return to an era when generals at the front calculate diesel needs on maps. Meanwhile, the Russian Railways addition of a $7 war risk surcharge is pushing many private operators, especially small carriers, out of the system. The math is clear. Rising costs per wagon, plus the government's subsidy squeeze, will push freight prices up by 12% by the end of 2025. This increase will be reflected in flour prices for grain, bean costs for steel, and bread and rent for citizens. At this point, the question becomes clear. How flexible is Russia's war logistics, and how much can it take before it breaks? When the existing artery stretching from Volgograd to Crimea is cut off, the remaining route is a winding railway line through Kuban to the eastern coast of the Black Sea. However, this route is constrained by both structural and geographical limitations. Narrow tunnels, aging viaducts, and inadequate signaling systems reduce transportation efficiency. If Ukraine's Boba-type unmanned systems are deployed more densely around the Azov region, the bridges and crossings on this backup route will also come within range. When this happens, Russia's logistics will have to spread from the central backbone to rural arteries and then to unpaved secondary routes. This is not only a waste of time, thermal fuel consumption increases by up to 30%, and transport time doubles. When the fuel requirements of armored divisions are factored in, a daily supply norm of 12,000 tons dropping to 8,000 tons would disrupt artillery battery firing schedules, delay ammunition distribution for TOS-1 and MSD-B systems, and shift operational intensity. Logistical disruptions not only affect the front's supply, but also redefine its striking power. This does not change the pace of the war, but its character. The Kremlin has yet to find a response to these strikes. Pantsir missiles are expensive, S-400 launchers cannot keep up with the number of drones, and train crews are on edge. While state television tries to salvage the day by claiming 74 drones were shot down, social media images of burning locomotives scream the truth. The Rostov front is burning, and the steel network is crumbling into rubble. The issue is no longer how many drones were shot down, but which lines can be restored by tomorrow morning. Drones emerging from Ukraine's digital hive are slicing Russia's iron backbone into pieces. When the logistics wheel stops, the front line will, too. The countdown echoes along the tracks, and instead of trains, sirens wail. Who will continue to turn the switches of Russian railways? The answer grows clearer with each new buzz of a drone. So, how do you think Russia can handle this logistics crisis? How much can these attacks change the course of the war? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinions are valuable to both us and our community. Until we meet again with new developments, take care of yourselves. Thank you for watching.
Russia's once seemingly invincible energy empire is now in ruins. Ukraine's kamikaze drones are targeting not the front lines, but the refineries that keep the Kremlin's war machine running. It's not just a few barrels. The system is collapsing. By mid-2025, 14% of Russia's total oil refining capacity will be gone. It's not burning, it's not ash, it's not working. This isn't just an energy issue, it's a shift in war doctrine. Ukraine is no longer targeting the enemy's army. It's targeting its fuel, its pace, its hope. In this video, we examine how a country with the world's largest energy resources has turned into a customer waiting in line for gasoline. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with a silent buzz, undetectable by radar, undetectable by air defenses, unaccounted for by the Kremlin's security doctrine. A low-cost drone launched from hundreds of kilometers away, guided by algorithms and a war strategy developed not in a classroom but on the battlefield. It was inconspicuous. It did not carry the weight of a cruise missile or the threat of a nuclear warhead, but it carried something far more deadly for the Russian war machine: a plan. The target was not a trench, a tank, or a command center. It was a refinery, a piece of infrastructure that had long been untouchable, irrelevant to frontline tactics. But that assumption is now up in flames, because by mid-2025, Ukraine had achieved what no package of sanctions or diplomatic pressure campaign could. With individual unmanned aerial vehicles, it severed the economic arteries of the Russian Federation. 14%. No one in Moscow can deny this figure. 14% of Russia's total oil refining capacity is gone. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't temporarily shut down. It was completely destroyed. The boilers burned. The distillation towers collapsed. SCADA control systems were irreparably destroyed. This is not theoretical damage. This is a measurable disaster. Practically speaking, this means that Russia has lost approximately 40 million metric tons of refined fuel capacity from its domestic economy. This translates to the loss of approximately 1.5 million barrels of diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, and military-grade lubricants per day. For a country reliant on mechanized warfare, this is not a problem. This is a death sentence. What is even more humiliating for the Kremlin is not just the loss itself, but the manner in which the attack was carried out. These attacks were not carried out with billion-dollar bombers or hypersonic warheads. They were carried out by small, cheap, programmable machines known as unmanned aerial vehicles, which are typically launched from modified trucks, operate with digital stealth, and are made from off-the-shelf components. The cost to Ukraine for each refinery hit is estimated at tens of thousands of dollars. The cost to Russia was billions of dollars in lost products, infrastructure damage, and future market reliability. This is not sabotage. This is a calculated, scalable, and repeatable system-wide economic war. And it's working. The first signs appeared in January, with Ukraine's strike on the Ilski refinery in Krasnodar. Flames rose. Production lines stopped. This incident was considered an isolated incident. But then Syzran, Novochakhtinsk, and then the huge Ryazan factory were hit. The Kinev in Leningrad and the Rosneft facilities in Ryazan are also undergoing partial fire repairs, leaving the southern military logistics with no surplus supply. Since the beginning of the year, successive attacks have rendered a total of 26.5 million tons of refinery capacity inoperable. This figure corresponds to approximately 15% of Russia's domestic diesel production and 1/5 of the high-sulfur fuel oil exports destined for export. For example, in March, the surplus Urals oil that could not be sold to Europe was diverted to India, forcing an additional 330,000 barrels per day, according to Izvestia. When facilities close to Black Sea ports such as Ilski are shut down, shipments have to be rerouted via the Ural River to the Baltic port of Primorsk. This means that freight costs rise from $2.50 per barrel to $4.10, pushing the Urals Brent price difference back to $20. As the difference grows, the rubles flowing into the budget under the government's variable export tax formula on oil decline. The Ministry of Finance closed the first half of the year with an energy revenue shortfall of 1.2 trillion rubles, and this figure is expected to deepen in the second half. The hidden cost of refinery fires is not only lost barrels, but also increased insurance premiums. Following the March attacks, several major reinsurers covering Russian energy facilities raised their per-barrel risk premiums by 18%. The fire at Ilski led to an additional 3 percentage points being added to premiums for 8 fuel terminals and pipeline exit stations in the Krasnodar region. The series of recurring fires has also cut off Moscow's access to foreign reinsurers, forcing state-owned companies to resort to a conditional compulsory self-insurance model. The premiums transferred to the treasury each month reduce the rubles allocated to the defense budget and postpone energy companies' investment projects. Gazprom Neft's $6 billion upstream expansion program for 2025 was reduced to $4.5 billion at the end of February, while Rosneft's $5.1 billion budget for drilling in Siberian fields was cut to $3.8 billion in the latest revision. On the one hand, the embargo is making it difficult to find technology and pipeline equipment, while on the other hand, refinery damage is reducing cash flow, forcing companies to slow down new drilling, which will lower production ceilings in the medium term. The decline in oil export volumes is also putting pressure on the ruble. When the Urals-Brent spread widens to $15, Russian barrels must be sold at a discount of over 12%. When the central bank sells foreign currency to banks to cover import bills, reserves are depleted.
The Russian army has once again come to the brink of collapse. This time it wasn't a platoon that withdrew from the scene, but a fully fledged regiment. There were no orders from above, nor was there an attack on the front lines. The silence in the trenches was actually an echo of how Russian morale had quietly collapsed. Russia's professional army myth has been buried in digital records. So, in a war where desertion from the front lines is so blatant, what victory could the Kremlin still be talking about? Russia's strategic encirclement plan on the northern front has failed. The Kremlin's goal was clear: to tie down Ukraine's defense reserves in the border regions, lock them into the area around Sumy, and ease the pressure on its offensive in the east. For this reason, a large Russian force expanded from around Belgorod and Graveron and gathered at the border from the north. They crossed the border to undermine the flexible harassment doctrine and push into Ukraine's interior. However, they were met not with an unprepared defense but a planned counterattack. Ukrainian ground forces commander Alexander Siersky had anticipated Russia's move months in advance. He established a strong defensive network east of Sumy, particularly along the Kindrativka, Andriivka and Oleksiivka lines. The importance of this line was not only geographical but also strategic. Ukraine would no longer merely defend its border, it would launch a counterattack at the right time and in the right place. Zelensky and Siersky appeared before the cameras and spoke clearly. "We will no longer just defend ourselves." These words represented not just a change in policy, but a direct transformation of the command structure on the ground. The implementation did not delay. Within days, Ukrainian forces launched precision drone strikes against Russian outposts in the region. This was followed by small-scale attrition raids supported by artillery and drones. It was not a heavy attack, but a controlled tactical pressure designed to push the Russian side into impatience. The Russian side initially thought these attacks were a frontal shock. Therefore, instead of sending large reinforcements to the area, they tried to manage with secondary units to protect their positions. However, Ukraine's pressure lasted not hours but days. As a result of intense attacks, first Kindrativka and then Andriivka fell under Ukrainian control. Both villages are located directly on the road to Sumy. This was not just the loss of 2 villages, but a breach in Russia's right flank. Now Ukrainian troops are at the gates of Oleksiivka. The village is surrounded on 3 sides. Armored vehicles of the 117th Mechanized Brigade are approaching from the southwest, while infantry units supported by artillery are advancing from the north and east, breaking through the positions. The Russian defense lines are beginning to crumble. The number of retreating soldiers is increasing. That sentence was the first link in a chain that would break apart behind the front lines. Drone operators couldn't keep up with counting the tank turrets. Despite 3 years of harsh conditions, for the first time, an entire brigade was breaking the chain of command and fleeing for their lives. The route of the tank column, which was being broadcast live to global media, was confirmed by satellite companies' subsequent footage. What was visible to the naked eye was this. The convoy turned around Kindrativka, reached the Andriivka border, slipped into the forest line, and instead of turning toward Belgorod, veered north. However, frontline radio traffic told a different story. Fuel rations had been reduced to 50 litres per soldier. Half of the ammunition had been left behind because the northern depot had blown up during the day shift, and instead of orders, template messages like "hold your positions" were being sent. When there is no hope left, the first rule is broken: the unit saves itself. Thermal images confirmed that they had fled before the engine blocks had cooled. They had no means to wait for a tow truck from their own ranks. The crew abandoned their armor 4 to 5 kilometers from the front line and blended into the riverbank. 1/3 of the attacks targeted ammunition trucks, 1/3 targeted fuel tankers, and the rest targeted portable radar and radio towers. The impact of each successful strike is felt directly at the front. If artillery batteries are firing 600 rounds a day, that number drops below 200 on the evening the depot is hit. Ukrainian analysts call this leakage logistics. Even if the point you hit is small, it cuts off the breath of infantry and armored vehicles with limited fuel reserves. In the heat of battle, the red light on the engine gauge triggers a collapse in morale. That's when the escape begins. The moral impact of this breakdown spread across social media in just a few hours. Channels created by Russian soldiers' mothers were flooded with posts like, "The Sumi group is silent. My son hasn't written in 5 days." Lists leaked from a mobile storage center in Belgorod confirmed the shortage of fuel wagons. When logistics routes are disrupted by a swarm of drones equivalent to a train, waiting lines can stretch up to 60 hours. At that point, if the commander at the front has no fuel, the only option left is to order the tanks to dig in and wait. The fact that the machines pulled into the line of fire were not designed for trenches also accelerated the escape. The T-80 chassis is heavy. Its tracks sit deep, and it doesn't dig in the rear to prevent movement. Once the fuel runs out, it becomes a massive target. Even the withdrawal orders, issued by commanders, couldn't reach the rear in time because radio towers were frequent targets of Ukrainian FPV attacks. The Ukrainian side did not use this situation merely as a trump card behind the front lines. It also turned it into a media strategy. At the same time, the headline that caught attention in the technical support packages arriving from the West was the land-based variant of the Magura V5 naval drones with extended range. The new kamikaze swarms, designed to strike fuel tankers, not in open terrain, but at river crossings inside the border, were equipped with additional target classification capabilities, thanks to a software update. They could now distinguish between tankers, heavy tanks, and open wagons. On the contrary, Russia remains silent. However, officers on the front lines say that this expansion is militarily unsustainable. Russia once again relied on its armor, but this time it faced not just a defensive line, but a calculated ambush. A massive Russian armored convoy of 71 vehicles was advancing toward Siversk. Inside were tanks, armored personnel carriers, motorcycle reconnaissance units, and fast strike teams. All were deployed to the battlefield, but Russian commanders failed to account for one thing. The 54th and 81st Brigades were waiting exactly where they were supposed to be. What happened next? On July 27th, Russian forces had gathered near the village of Verknokamyanka. 6 T-72B3M tanks, arranged in 3 rows, 3 BMP-2 armored personnel carriers, 6 MT-LB tracked tractors, 1 BEM recovery vehicle, 2 light buggies, and 12 pickup trucks linked together began moving forward. 41 motorcycles were also at the rear of the convoy. The Russian convoy's intention was to launch a surprise attack towards Zolotarivka, first catching the Ukrainian defense off guard, then pushing back the western flank surrounding Siversk. But this time, they were not facing an ordinary defense line. Ukraine's 54th Mechanized Brigade and 81st Airborne Brigade had been preparing in the area for weeks. The convoy's route had been identified beforehand, and a series of drone surveillance points and artillery coordination networks had been set up in the area. The 54th Brigade had been defending this front, which had seen some of the fiercest fighting in the region since 2022. They knew the terrain and the enemy's habits like the back of their hands. The 81st Brigade, meanwhile, was renowned for its rapid response, high mobility, and flanking maneuvers. 2 T-64BV tanks from the 81st Air Assault Brigade approached the northern edge of the riverbed and took up positions in the shade. An M113 armored ambulance was parked beside them. As soon as the Russian convoy emerged from the tree line, reconnaissance drones had already taken up positions on the hilltop. As soon as movement was detected, the first salvo arrived with 155mm artillery fire. The Ukrainian tank commander then locked onto a sudden heat signature detected by his thermal imaging system. About 90 meters away, a Russian armored vehicle was slowly emerging from between the trees. Its hull was heavily reinforced with anti-drone grills. This was a T-72B3 with improvised armor enhancements. To protect the approximately 46-ton T-72 and its 3-person crew, the grills were welded to the upper structure, along with additional steel panels. The armor protection was reinforced with composite armor and Contact 5 explosive reactive armor systems. While this reinforcement aimed to protect it from airborne FPV attacks, this time death would come not from the sky, but from the barrel of the opposing gun. The Ukrainian sniper quickly made his calculations. The T-64BV's 125mm gun was loaded with a heat round. The Russian tank's blind spot was the dome area at the rear left, where there was no armor reinforcement. After a moment of silence, the trigger was pulled. The shell struck the Russian tank's upper structure, directly beneath the turret. At the moment of the explosion, the turret was thrown aside, and the turret itself jumped half a meter upward. However, the fatal blow was not this. Despite the severe shock, the vehicle managed to maneuver backward by forcing its engine. The damage was critical, but the crew was still inside. The Russian tank could only reach a speed of 50 kilometers per hour on the difficult terrain. The Ukrainian drones, however, were much faster. Within minutes, the drone team lying in ambush on the hilltop released an FPV drone loaded with explosives. The drone flew over the trees and headed toward the Russian tank in the burning forest. It embedded itself in the rear armor and exploded. This second blow ignited the fuel tank. The T-72B3 turned into a ball of flames. Since the ammunition was being transported openly in the automatic loader inside the tank, the fire could not be extinguished. In the panic, some vehicles tried to retreat, but became stuck in the narrow path within the forest. FPV drones were waiting for this opportunity. Kamikaze drones, first targeting the tank turrets and then the engine blocks of the BTRs, shattered the armored line within minutes. However, Ukraine's plan did not end there. The convoy had been stopped. Now it was time for destruction. The 81st Brigade's light infantry units launched an attack along the armored line at a 3-quarter angle. At this point in the battle, the Russian side's plan should have been to gain momentum. They couldn't do that either. The reason was the breakdown of logistics. The Brem recovery vehicle accompanying the convoy was preparing to tow the first damaged tank when 2 more FPVs closed in on it. The driver's door was shattered, and the crane operator was injured. With no team left to rescue the tank, the convoy's speed dropped once again. Thus, the Russian soldiers, surrounded from the sides and rear, were left defenseless in open terrain. They were not given the opportunity to reposition themselves through quick maneuvers and coordinated fire. Russian infantry disembarking from transport vehicles encountered mini-mortar fire, automatic rifles, and homemade explosives before they could even dig in. Some armored vehicles were abandoned in the forest because their equipment had malfunctioned or the crew had been lost. Just a few minutes after the fighting began, at least 5 Russian tanks lined up side by side in an open area at the edge of the forest caught fire simultaneously. All that remained were thick black smoke, the echoes of exploding ammunition, and intertwined piles of metal. Tank turrets were hurled meters away. Some vehicles' ammunition depots exploded from within. Within the first 45 minutes, at least 20 armored vehicles were rendered inoperable by coordinated fire from Ukrainian artillery and FPV drone teams. Tanks, BMP-2s, armored personnel carriers and most motorized units were either destroyed by fire or abandoned. Russian units attempting to advance along the narrow forest strip, now under a no-fly zone, were repeatedly detected and subjected to sudden fire. Satellite imagery clearly revealed extensive burn marks, ammunition fragments, and traces of secondary explosions at various points in the area. Tree trunks remained charred and broken, while the ground was littered with craters caused by large-caliber artillery shells. The number of Russian military vehicles left behind after the battle was staggering. Only 1 BREM armored recovery vehicle, 1 MTLB personnel carrier, and 1 truck remained operational. They were later withdrawn from the area while being monitored by Ukrainian surveillance drones. According to initial estimates, 48 Russian soldiers were neutralized at the scene, while 69 others were injured to varying degrees. Most of the wounded were either pulled from the rubble or found defenseless near the exploding vehicles. Even the basic numbers of this clash demonstrated how the war economy had been turned upside down. Russia had deployed heavy armor worth approximately $90 million. Ukraine, on the other hand, inflicted over 10 times the damage by using 6 Sabot rounds, 12 HET shells, 16 FPV drones, and 8 Excalibur missiles. Beyond the financial toll, the moral damage was immeasurable. According to Ukrainian General Staff data, Russia had hoped to flatten the tank loss curve in the first 25 days of July, but units trapped in sectors like Sumy and Siversk reignited the upward trend. Moscow's only hope was to accelerate the tank repair and overhaul line through Belarus. However, the F-35 task force deployed between Poland and Lithuania was turning every covered wagon on the Brest-Homel railway into a live intelligence source. Reserve tanks were being hit by drone strikes before they could cross the border. Russian commanders were increasingly vocal in their conclusion that a mass offensive strategy was unsustainable at a stage where heavy armor could not reach the front lines safely. Data on Russian fire intensity around Siversk over the past 2 weeks also confirmed this. The daily average of 800 rounds fired per day had dropped to 500. The ammunition conservation order was presented to field artillery units as a paper plan aiming for the same effective fire with 1/3 of the ammunition. In reality, however, less ammunition meant less frequent barrages, giving Ukrainian infantry more room for bold maneuvers. 2 days after the clash, the 81st Brigade dug 3 kilometers further back behind the defense line to expand tank barriers. They were certain that no Russian artillery remained capable of drowning out the sound of construction machinery. Moscow's initial response to this failed offensive was official silence. There is another point not mentioned in the summary data, but frequently discussed behind the scenes at the front. Russia's own drone defense doctrine is proving inadequate in such conflicts. Since no Orlan-10 or Zala reconnaissance UAVs were deployed over the convoy, the approaching FPVs were able to dive freely onto the vehicle tracks. The reason is an electronic warfare vulnerability. The Stavropol signal attack had hit Russian jammer equipment production. It was said that it would take days to see the results on the ground, but the Siversk raid reduced that to hours. The lack of damaged radar jammers at the Kret facilities left the convoy virtually exposed. By the middle of 2025, the real picture on the battlefield had become increasingly alarming for Russia. While some tactical gains were made, the cost of these gains had reached unsustainable levels in terms of both human lives and military equipment. According to data compiled by Western intelligence services and independent analysis organizations, Russia's total losses exceeded 1 million. Approximately 500,000 of these were soldiers who either died in combat or were wounded so severely that they could not return. This is not merely a statistic, it is concrete evidence of the human cost of the war and the depletion of Russia's military personnel reserves. Material losses further compound this grim picture. Since February 2022, approximately 10,000 tanks and over 13,000 artillery systems have been destroyed on the battlefield. The majority of these were neutralized by Ukraine's increasingly precise drone strikes, Western-made long-range munitions, and advanced counter-battery tactics. In particular, since 2024, precision munitions such as Hay-He-May-Arez, AASM Hammer, Excalibur, and Storm Shadow have rendered Russian armored units virtually defenseless on the front lines. However, what is even more striking is that these losses cannot be offset by the production capacity of the Russian military-industrial complex. Relying on Soviet-era production infrastructure from the 1980s, the Russian defense industry is struggling to mass-produce high-tech and high-quality systems. Western sanctions have largely blocked access to sensitive components, such as chips and optical systems. Major tank manufacturers like Uralvagonzavod can only refurbish and send a few dozen tanks to the front each month. New production has nearly ground to a halt. This production bottleneck has made Russia increasingly dependent on foreign suppliers. Since late 2023, North Korea has become Russia's primary source of artillery ammunition. By the end of 2024, it is estimated that up to 60% of the artillery shells in use on the battlefield will have come from North Korea. However, Most of these shells have serious quality issues. Some batches have a dud rate of up to 20%, while some munitions have caused barrel swelling and recoil malfunctions. This situation directly affects not only the effectiveness of the munitions, but also the lifespan of the artillery systems used. This enormous cost is fueling silent but significant public discontent. While open protest is dangerous, the sentiment is clear. A survey conducted by the independent Levada Center in late 2024 found that 57% of Russians support peace negotiations, but only 35% want the war to continue. Putin has avoided a second mass mobilization precisely because he fears public backlash. The inability to muster sufficient volunteer forces to cover monthly casualty rates poses a critical obstacle to war efforts. The most visible opposition comes from the wives and mothers of mobilized soldiers, who regularly stage small protests near the Kremlin demanding the return of their loved ones. The majority of the Russian people may be in a state of passive acquiescence, but this is a fragile consensus born of weakness, not enthusiastic support. The significant increase in the demands of the war on ordinary families could easily shatter this consensus. Given the state's repressive capacity and the fragmented nature of the opposition, a mass popular uprising is the least likely outcome in the near term. However, a devastating military defeat or a complete economic collapse could serve as a black swan event, triggering widespread unrest that could overwhelm the security forces. Let's summarize the situation. The tank duel around Siversk demonstrated how vulnerable classic armored assaults can be in the face of electronic surveillance, drone sabotage, and low-profile ambushes. After 6 minutes of initial fire contact, the fate of the battle was decided not by tracks and firepower, but by the optical algorithm satellite triad. Russia still relies on the shock effect of mass armor, rooted in Soviet psychology. Ukraine, however, has already neutralized this shock by making fire decisions with a single click on a drone screen. While the psychological impact of their losses is downplayed in Moscow corridors as a temporary setback, for the soldier on the front lines, this outcome is the most concrete evidence that the command fuel ammunition chain can break simultaneously. If Belgorod fuel convoys are not replenished and no new jammers emerge from Stavropol in the coming days, every new tank motorcycle assault order will disintegrate faster than the last. The drone debris and burned tank turrets floating in the Siversk Valley are, for now, a silent but powerful reminder of this. What are your thoughts on this matter? We would appreciate it if you could share your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. Your support is invaluable to us. We look forward to seeing you in our next analysis. Thank you for watching.
If Russia's heart is in oil, Ukraine is firing directly at that heart. As refineries across the country are rocked by successive explosions, the red smoke rising into the sky is no longer just a threat to the Kremlin, but a harbinger of impending collapse. From Krasnodar to Ryazan, from Ilski to Syzran, numerous strategic energy facilities have been struck, destroyed, or shut down. Like a giant whose energy arteries have been severed, Russia is slowly being engulfed in darkness. For the Russian people, it is now an ordinary night, defined by the sounds of drones, explosions, and the echoes of fire truck sirens. The sense of security has vanished. As refineries burn, the Kremlin remains silent, and the economy bleeds more each day. It is not just Russia that is on edge, the world is too. Because these fires are not merely a local crisis, they are erupting at the very heart of global energy balances. Now we take a closer look at the backstory of this rupture, the strategic implications of the attacks, and their global consequences. After nearly 4 months of silence, the Ukrainian armed forces have resumed targeting Russia's energy infrastructure. The Ilski oil refinery in Krasnodar Krai was the target of a large-scale drone attack carried out during the night. Local sources reported several explosions, followed by a fireball illuminating the sky and the buzzing of drone engines echoing through the air. Shortly afterward, drone debris and thick plumes of smoke were seen rising from the facility's interior. The attack was indirectly confirmed by Ukraine's military intelligence unit, ATSHR. The statement emphasized that the Ilski refinery is not only a civilian energy center, but also a military asset providing logistical fuel support to Russian troops in the southern military district. This designation officially classifies the facility as a military target. What is known about the facility's strategic importance? The Ilski oil refinery is one of the largest private refinery operations in southern Russia, with a processing capacity of over 6 million tons of crude oil per year. The facility is located in the town of Ilski in the Seversky region and supplies products for both domestic consumption and international energy exports. Refined products such as diesel, gasoline, fuel oil, and bitumen are produced here. Most importantly, these products are transported to global markets via the Black Sea ports of Novorossiysk and Taman. However, in the context of the war, the facility has a more critical function. It directly supplies fuel to Russian troops stationed in occupied Ukrainian territories. This makes the facility not only an economic target, but also an indispensable link in Russia's fuel supply chain along the front lines. The technical aspects and impact of the attack also warrant attention. According to local media outlets and open-source news platforms like Excelenova, the targeted sections of the facility sustained significant damage. The fire that broke out after the explosion affected diesel production units and intermediate storage tanks in particular. Although not yet officially confirmed, it is believed that AI-supported UJ-26 Bober-type kamikaze UAVs were used in the attack. Emergency response teams were dispatched to the area, but extinguishing efforts continued for a long time due to high temperatures. Initial reports indicate that the diesel hydrocracking unit and 3 associated intermediate storage tanks were engulfed in flames, resulting in a loss of at least 30% of the facility's crude oil processing capacity. This 30% reduction represents the source of fuel for approximately 700 of the 2,400 tanker trucks that Russia sends to the front lines daily. When tanker traffic is disrupted, the fuel requirements of the armored vehicle column shift from Rostov to the Volga region. As a result, the supply line extends by 400 kilometers and becomes more vulnerable to drone attacks in open terrain. On the energy macro balance side, the production gap in Ilski could have been filled by the Rostov-Novochakhtinsk and Samara-Syzran refineries. However, both have not yet returned to full capacity following the kamikaze drone attacks in March-February. The Kinev plant in Leningrad and the Rosneft facility in Ryazan are also continuing partial repairs following fires, leaving no surplus supply for southern military logistics. Since the beginning of the year, successive attacks have rendered a total of 26.5 million tons of refinery capacity unusable. This figure corresponds to approximately 15% of Russia's domestic diesel production and 1/5 of the high-sulfur fuel oil exports destined for export. For example, in March, the surplus of Urals oil that could not be sold to Europe was redirected to India, forcing an additional 330,000 barrels per day, according to Izvestia data. When facilities near the Black Sea port, such as Ilski, are offline, shipments must be rerouted via the Ural River route to the Primorsk port in the Baltic. This results in a rise in freight costs from $2.50 per barrel to $4.10 per barrel, pushing the Urals Brent price differential back to the $20 level. As the difference grows, the rubles entering the budget under the government's variable export tax formula on oil are eroding. The Ministry of Finance closed the first half of the year with an energy revenue shortfall of 1.2 trillion rubles, and this figure is expected to deepen in the second half. The hidden cost of refinery fires is not only lost barrels, but also increased insurance premiums. Following the March attacks, several major reinsurers covering Russian energy facilities raised their per-barrel risk premiums by 18%. The fire at Ilski led to an additional 3 percentage points being added to premiums for 8 fuel terminals and pipeline exit stations in the Krasnodar region. The recurring series of fires has also cut off Moscow's access to foreign reinsurers.
Russia's Black Sea cities are in flames, Ukraine bombed Putin's valuable assets in Krasnodar and Sochi for the first time. Airports, refineries, and ammunition depots. But that wasn't the most striking part of the operation. Putin had once again launched a major attack on civilian targets in Odessa after the peace talks, but Ukraine immediately retaliated and took its revenge. So what did Putin lose with Ukraine's retaliation, and why did Ukraine strike this blow in Sochi? On July 24th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, at a meeting in Istanbul yesterday, a proposal for an immediate and complete ceasefire was presented to the Russian side. In response, Russian drones are hitting residential buildings. For Kiev, this was a familiar pattern. The talks end, Odessa burns. Deputy Prime Minister Ilski said that Russia launched 103 drones and 4 missiles in a nighttime attack, striking civilian infrastructure, including ports, transportation hubs, and residential areas. Ukraine then launched a larger retaliatory attack. On the night of July 24th, unmanned aerial vehicles attacked the cities of Sochi and Adler in Russia's Krasnodar region, and an oil depot near Sochi airport was hit. This was not just a simple drone attack, but a blow that destroyed Putin's tourism and oil economy in the Black Sea. The Retaliation plan, coded as a counter-cost operation in the sensitive economic semicircle in the report of the Ukrainian General Staff, consisted of 23 unmanned aerial vehicles targeting the Sochi-Adler aviation fuel complex on the eastern slope of the Black Sea. The plan looked simple on the map. Take off from the Azov grey zone along the Azov coast, divert westward at sea level under the radar umbrella of the Crimean Peninsula, and climb towards Sochi's blind southeast radar sector over the Taman Peninsula. The actual operational technique went far beyond this. The 91N6E radar, stationed on the 40V6 mast, which Russian air defense had considered an angular lifeguard until now, kept its antenna in a fixed position facing northwest instead of the Black Sea, and therefore could not see the lower 50-meter layer used by the Boba-derived UAD-26s as they drew from the coast. Meanwhile, the thermal optics of the Pantsir S-1 batteries mistook the fake heat masks added in September 2024 for real targets. The electronic warfare compartment was unable to prevent the Boba swarm from switching from dual satellite navigation to topographic matching. Ukraine's raid on Sochi was recorded at 23:07, according to official data from the Civil Aviation Agency, with an alarm sounding in the airport's approach area. Runway lights were dimmed, and 8 aircraft, 3 domestic and 5 charter, were forced to circle in the air. At 23:26, a warning was issued of an uncontrolled fire in the immediate vicinity. This was when the first of the Boba-type UAVs hit a row of fuel tankers north of the runway. Emergency officials in Russia's Black Sea region of Krasnodar confirmed drone attacks at the airport in the Adler district near Sochi. Flights were cancelled for hours. Sochi International Airport was closed between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. 97 flights were delayed in many cities across Russia. Passengers in Novosibirsk, Omsk, and Tomsk were stranded, waiting for planes that could not land. The second wave of drones locked onto a refinery storage facility at 11:40 p.m. The most critical facility here was 2 large tanks storing RT-class jet fuel. If they caught fire, Sochi Airport would lose its continuous fuel buffer, and even after the runway was opened, it would not be possible to refuel the tankers. The Ukrainian General Staff spokesman confirmed this detail the next morning, saying, "The goal was not to target tourists, but to cut off the fuel supply." The head of the Sirius Federal District south of Sochi said a drone had hit an oil base, but did not provide further details. The Russian Aviation Authority reported that operations at Sochi Airport were suspended for about 4 hours. Dmitry Plishkin, head of the Sirius Federal District in Krasnodar Krai, said, "An attack was carried out on an oil depot on Tavricheskaya Street. Lukoil Yugnefta Produkt confirmed that its oil depot at 1/4 Tavricheskaya Street in Sochi had been hit. The storage farm at the port of Sochi is a strategic intermediate station that stores crude oil from the Kachinsky-Tuapse pipeline prior to loading onto sea tankers. This facility also supplies bunker fuel to passenger ships docking at the Sochi port and serves as an emergency fuel oil reserve for 4 thermal power plants in the region. The 2 large storage tanks that exploded had a total capacity of 36,000 cubic meters of jet fuel. The local emergency ministry sprayed firefighting foam around the tanks for 24 hours, but the heat of the fire, which exceeded 250 degrees Celsius, shrunk the metal of the tanks like lemon peel. According to an internal Rosneft report, it will take 10 days to safely remove the remaining fuel. And since the secondary tanks are also full, the Sochi Tuapse tanker program has been suspended. According to leaked notes from Ukrainian defense intelligence, the main platform in the convoy was a new version of the UJ-26 Boba. An artificial intelligence module added to the previous variant automatically identifies radar antennas surrounding the target airport and recalculates the flight altitude that will provide the lowest radar cross-section twice per second. Link 16 was closed, meaning that instantaneous route updates were made without the need for allied data streams. When the thermal optics of the Russian Pantsir S-1 batteries failed to detect hot targets flying parallel to the sea, they were slow to lock onto the radar. The S-400's main search radar is mounted on a 40 V6 mast facing the coast, with a blind spot in the southeast sector. The Boba swarm climbed out of this blind sector. Technical summary. The fan scan angle on the defense line was not 100%, and Boba exploited this. This was the first time that open-source hardware and software support obtained by Kiev from Baykar, Edge Autonomics, and the Lithuanian-Estonian joint venture Skynetics was tested in the field in a scaled swarm configuration. The most frightening detail for Russia is the reduction of its dependence on global navigation. Boba still uses GPS, but even if the line is cut, it switches to an alternative using topographic matching. For many years, Russia has proudly carried the label of one of the world's most diverse defense industries. Caliber cruise missiles, T-90 tank families, Su-34 bomber jets, and the now famous Lancet Shahed kamikaze drones. If you listen closely to the Kremlin's official rhetoric, all these systems are tied together under a single umbrella and flow onto the battlefield via production lines that are said to be uninterruptible. But the harsh Ukrainian moves that began in June 2025 and grew step by step until the end of July cut this chain in unexpected places. It didn't happen overnight. The Kiev team drew up a long-term plan, marked the weak links on the map, and stretched the range of unmanned aerial vehicles a little more each month. The result was a sudden stumble in defense production, the Putin administration's most valuable showcase. Let's make this clear. What we're talking about isn't the explosion of a single ammunition depot in a border town. What we are referring to is the successive shutdown of the nodes of a complex supply network that feeds the electronic brains of Caliber missiles, the fluids that lubricate the pistons of T-90 tanks, the bombs of Su-34s, and the control cards of Shahed-derived kamikaze drones. That is why it is not an exaggeration to say that Putin's defense industry is collapsing. The figures you're about to see will concretely demonstrate how Russia has begun to count its ammunition. Here's the really important part. The drone attacks did not just blow up warehouses, they also shook the Russian central bank's plan to keep the ruble afloat. Let's break down the timeline step by step. The first attack on the Rezonit complex, located approximately 40 kilometers from Moscow in the last week of June, served as a starting signal. The facility produced special hydraulic oils for the guidance valves of Caliber and Iskander missiles, Lancet servo motors, and engine bearing fluids for T-90 tanks. Annual production volume was 121 tons. One-third of this volume was allocated to ground forces, one-fourth to the missile air segment, and the remainder to civilian machinery. A Beaver U-type drone that penetrated the roof in the middle of the night ignited barrels filled with isopropyl, and the fire spread along the facility. The warehouse floor turned into a pile of metal within 30 minutes. The high heat melted the internal computers in the sensor calibration room. The impact of this attack on the front lines was faster than expected. The maintenance departments of Russian tank units serving in the Donetsk area reported a delay in the delivery of hydraulic fluid. By the end of the same week, 15% of the T-90 tanks deployed to the front via Belgorod were recalled for repairs. When the fluid required for the engine piston bearings was found to be missing, the tank's speed limits were reduced, and body vibrations increased during firing. What seemed like a negligible chemical loss undermined both fire superiority and maneuverability in the field. At the same time, a psychological barrier was erected, as this was the first time an industrial facility so close to the Kremlin had been swallowed up. Let's now move on to Tambov. The nitrocellulose gunpowder reactor here was a modernized version of the basic ammunition concept from the Soviet era. It produced the propellant for a wide range of products, from artillery shells to MLRS rockets. 3 separate waves of Ukrainian UAVs struck the reactor's main boiler. The boiler was destroyed, and the plant immediately entered an emergency shutdown procedure. It was thought that production would be buffered by ready stocks, but reports indicated that gunpowder supplies to the front were delayed by around 30%. This reduced the intensity of Russian shelling on the Kharkiv-Liman line. When data from the field was combined with satellite images, the loss to Tambov became clear. The Russian rocket gun price index jumped 14% in a single day. The Kremlin intervened in state procurement contracts to suppress prices, but this move also plunged the facility into a damage control spiral. The third stop was the Cheboksary electronics plant in Chuvashia. The Cheboksary electronics factory supplied critical electronic components for Shahid-type kamikaze drones and Iskander missiles. Unmanned aerial vehicles reaching this facility, located 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, have proven that no region of Russia is safe. This includes the safe zone designated in Russian defense plans. When the drone swarm penetrated the upper section, automation robots were disabled, and assembly presses came to a halt. It is estimated that this disruption will require up to a month of repairs. The outcome is clear. The Shahed production line is already 4,000 units behind schedule. Field demands have collided with production plans. While the arrival of kits from Iran to the assembly hall in Yelabuga was already problematic, the malfunction of the card press will extend the delivery timeline by another 2 to 3 weeks. Why did Kiev specifically choose Cheboksary? Because this facility's lower production line manufactures a critical control unit known as the P500-based integrated chip, which has no Chinese equivalent. By targeting this chip, Ukraine aimed to slow down Russia's Shahid stockpile in terms of quality rather than quantity. When you put pressure on manned aircrafts, the JSC Progress plant in Michurinsk was another sensitive target. It is a small but sophisticated electronic facility. It was one of the country's rare technology bases producing guidance mechanisms for Russian artillery systems, aircraft autopilots, and missile control systems. Guidance kits for artillery shells are pressed here. Parts for the autopilot systems of Su-34 aircraft are also produced here. Components serving the gas and oil infrastructure were also produced here. The attack dealt a heavy blow to both the military and civilian industries. American sources reported that 1,800 tons of artillery ammunition were rendered unusable as a result of this attack alone, causing losses of approximately 8 billion rubles. However, the critical point is not the overall toll, but the precision strike capability. Without guided artillery shells, the Russian military is forced to revert to its old habits, namely the blind firing logic. Blind firing reduces damage per rocket, but increases ammunition consumption. As stockpiles already dwindle, a drop in accuracy will erode morale and logistics simultaneously. So far, we have mentioned 4 critical targets. However, the picture is not bright for the rest of the chain either. The Azot chemical plant in the Tula region was a critical link in the supply chain for military-grade explosives. Ukraine's attack on this facility directly increased the production pressure on artillery ammunition and led to a significant decline in stockpile levels. The production of explosive intermediates at the Azot chemical plant in Tula has been reduced to 50% of capacity for the time being. The Savazlayka airfield ammunition depot in the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast was not only a logistics facility, but also a base for MiG-31Ks. The drone attack on the depot disrupted the Air Force's readiness. It was reported that the flight tempo dropped significantly following the attack. The Kazan gunpowder factory was one of the key ammunition sources in Tatarstan. Explosive production at this facility was of vital importance for both ground forces and the Air Force. The attack was seen as part of a systematic effort to undermine Russia's ammunition backbone. The Sverdlov factory in Nizhny Novgorod was an advanced technology center producing warheads and components for anti-aircraft missiles. The success achieved there directly impacted Russia's production capacity for short-range defense systems. The Lipetsk II airbase was a strategic hub housing tactical attack aircraft such as the Su-34 and Su-35. The drone attack on the ammunition depot disrupted the ammunition rotation of combat aircraft, slowing down operational tempo. And perhaps the most symbolic target was the Yelabuga drone factory. This facility, where Iranian-made Shahed drones are manufactured, was the direct source of the systems used to attack Ukrainian cities during the war. Now let's take a step back and look at the macro impact of the entire list of attacks. In a matter of weeks, 10 vital factories in Russia were hit. These attacks are putting Russia's defense industry under pressure on three fronts. First, there is the direct loss of production. Second, there is the gap that emerges during the repair period. Third, there is the psychological and economic multiplier effect. The burning of resin it cuts, not only chemical oil stocks but also tanker logistics. The transport company is increasing its insurance premium by 20% due to the risk of flammable substances. This additional cost is not reflected in defense supplies, but even in the diesel bills of civilian truckers. The problem is that the Kremlin cannot compensate for this production shift with other lines. Extra shifts have been added in Kazan for gunpowder, but even there, infrastructure capacity is at 90% of national production. Some of the raw materials come from Belarus. As the destruction grows, the Belarusian line cannot keep up. Attempts are being made to source chemical components from India, but long shipping times and high reinsurance costs are driving up costs. China wants to be brought in for hydraulic oil, but Chinese manufacturers are demanding tough contract guarantees due to the possibility of secondary sanctions. For years, Russia has been telling itself the fairy tale of being a shield against the sky. The S-300 and S-400 missile batteries were the pride and joy of Kremlin propaganda. It was claimed they could even shoot down hypersonic missiles. That myth was shattered on the night of July 20th, 2025, on a rural stretch between Belgorod and Kursk. The Ukrainian General Staff summed it up in a few lines. The 91 N6E and 92 N6E radar stations stationed near the villages of Kolodny and Tepel have been destroyed. In other words, the brain of the Russian air defense pyramid was torn from its body. This does not look like a random bombardment. Rather, it looks like a categorical attack against high-value air defense resources, eliminating the direct retroactive effect of tactical targeting and instead directly shattering Russian air superiority in the region. Now let's analyze how this double blow was delivered, why Moscow couldn't respond, and which dominoes each lost radar toppled, from the front lines to the economy. Between February 2022 and July 2025, according to OSINT sources, the following elements were permanently taken out of service in the field. 18 S-400 radar/launch vehicles, 43 S-300 battery components. The cost is approximately $7.8 billion at current list prices. Almaz-Ante's annual production is a maximum of 9 complete sets, meaning that the 2 radars in July wiped out the factory's output for 6 months. Let's clarify the picture first. The 91N6E hit at the Kolodny coordinates acts like a National Geographic camera for an S-400 regiment. It scans everything within a 600-kilometer radius and writes targets into subcells. The multifunctional 92N6E radar, parked next to it, acts as a fire control system, guiding the missile from the moment it is fired until the last second. The Baz 69092-012 Voshchina 1 tow trucks pulling this duo also caught fire in the frame. The system lost not only its missiles but also its eyes and ears. The 92N6E is an extremely important radar system used by Russia to monitor vast areas of airspace and quickly detect threats. The S-400's 91N6E long-range reconnaissance radar performs wide-beam scanning and uses narrow filtering to improve the signal-to-noise ratio at low altitudes. If you have a target with an RCS, radar cross-section, of less than 0.05 square meters, the screen will be flooded with interference in milliseconds. HIMARS missiles, on the other hand, have a radar cross-section of less than 0.03 square meters. This is below the threshold value of the radar's automatic target detection algorithm. The operator can only select pixel spots by manually zooming in, at which point the alarm warnings will activate larger traces. Why is a small RCS so critical? While the radar's automatic filter threshold is 0.05 square meters, the GMLRS-ER rocket appears as 0.03 square meters. The warning time before the operator manually zooms in is less than 8 seconds. Considering the hydraulic antenna rotation speed and missile launch timing, this practically means insufficient reaction time. The Ukrainian army silenced a fully operational S-300 and S-400 battery along the Belgorod and Kursk lines in a single night using HIMARS missiles fired from border villages in the Kharkiv region. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed in an official statement that Ukraine's long-range air defense capabilities had successfully destroyed Russian S-300P systems and S-400 radar equipment. So how did Russia fail to see such an attack coming? The answer lies in the layered deception package that Ukraine has developed over the past 5 months. In the first layer, kamikaze FPV drones appeared in swarms 10 found 15 kilometers from the front line. They made noise, left electromagnetic traces, and essentially shouted, "I'm coming," to the radar. Russian air defense systems panicked, and Pantsir guns fired at low altitudes. In the second layer, old Soviet-made Tu-141 Strij reconnaissance drones flew at low altitude with cheap pyrotechnic capsules attached to their wings. They left a fairly large radar signature, but they were unarmored. The S-400 batteries had to waste their expensive 48 N6DM missiles on these shells. This depleted the battery's stock of ammunition and cooled the charging cycle, blocking the firing sequence. By the time the third layer came around, the night sky was silent. The Russian operators had already launched their missiles, and their search radars had been blinded by a swarm of bird drones. It was at this moment that the real punch came. Ukraine has been developing its out-of-range strike capability for a long time. There are many possibilities being discussed, but the strongest scenario coming out of Kiev is that Storm Shadow, Scalp EG, or modernized R-360 Neptune-derived cruise missiles were used. Additionally, analysts suggest that the operation depends on Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, likely HIMARS or ATACMS systems, supplied by the West, and the weakening of targeting restrictions. A common feature of all these systems is their ability to fly at altitudes of 5 to 10 meters by scanning terrain, thereby reducing the risk of detection by using a radar altimeter INS guidance system instead of GPS. Russian radar systems are already blind to such a profile emerging from behind treetops. Moreover, in the terminal phase, the missile's warhead targets not a large radar mast, but the soft underbelly of a stationary tow truck. The impact point was chosen deliberately. Even if the radar antenna is not destroyed, the system will malfunction when the hydraulic power unit and generator are damaged. Don't think that when the radar is hit, only the battery in that village is silenced. The S-400 deployment doctrine resembles a 3-layered braid connected by data links. When one eye is lost, neighboring batteries also face the dilemma of send a missile, but who will see the target? This attack also hit an S-300PT stationed in another area on the Belgorod border on the same day. On the night of July 20th, one of the HIMARS M142s, which fired 6 tubes at once, used American-made GMLRS-ER missiles in actual combat for the first time. The standard M31A1 rocket has a range of 84 kilometers. The ER version, however, reaches 150 kilometers thanks to high-energy composite fuel and an optimized nose cone.
However, this illusion is beginning to crack. During the summer, Ukraine's counteroffensives exposed the depth of Russia's manpower crisis. All sectors are now run by foreign units, demoralized reservists, and recently conscripted prisoners. Still, Kiev is making progress. Not because it has more soldiers, but because it has smarter systems, better training, and the moral clarity of defending its homeland. The contrast could not be more stark. Russia is fighting with lies, mercenaries, and foreign blood. Ukraine is fighting with innovation, discipline, and purpose. Every North Korean soldier who lays down his arms confirms this. This is not a partnership. This is a tragedy. And the world must not confuse helplessness with strategy. And the truth buried beneath all this rotten collaboration is that the Kremlin no longer has an army capable of sustaining the war. Russia's losses are no longer just immeasurable, they are irreparable. Every inch of territory Moscow holds along the vast front stretching from Crimea to Donetsk is, in reality, a quagmire, a bottomless machine of attrition that draws in more troops every day, consumes more supplies, and causes more logistical collapse. The reality that Putin is trying to hide by playing with numbers is that, in the third year of the war, the Russian armed forces have effectively become dysfunctional. As we mentioned in our video with Ukraine's counteroffensives, at least 700,000 of the 1 million troops Russia deployed at the beginning of 2022 have been killed, permanently disabled, or deserted. This number is approximately 10 times the total losses incurred during the entire Soviet-Afghan War. Moreover, this figure is not just about human lives, it is also a sign of systematic collapse. Not only personnel, but also equipment is running out. The T-90M tanks that Putin once boasted about are now nothing more than floating targets for FPV kamikaze drones. Tanks abandoned on the front lines, with their turrets blown off, have become symbols of the war. The total number of armored vehicles Russia has lost by the end of 2023 has exceeded 14,000. Many of these were hit by Ukraine's thermal targeting-enabled drone operations. The crews inside the tanks often couldn't escape before the vehicles exploded. A significant portion of those who survived were unable to continue their duties due to psychological trauma. Not only were they not equipped with modern armor technology, but they were also completely defenseless against Western-made anti-tank systems such as Javelin and NLAW. However, the numbers tell another story. The systematic depletion of Russian artillery. Starting in the second half of 2024, the effectiveness of Russian artillery batteries declined dramatically. The reason was not just a shortage of ammunition, the artillery could no longer see its targets. Ukraine's electronic warfare capabilities had reached a level where they could disable 60% of the reconnaissance drones on the front lines. This means that Russian artillery cannot reach the coordinates necessary to deliver effective fire. Calibration errors have increased, and incidents of friendly fire have become more frequent. During the same period, over 1,200 artillery systems were either detected and destroyed by Ukraine or captured in abandoned condition. Each of these systems, worth several $1,000,000, is now being refurbished and put back into service by Ukraine. The logistical aspect of these losses is a complete disaster. The Frontline, which was supported throughout the first year of the war by supply lines from the Crimean Bridge, Belgorod, and Rostov, is now a target for drones and sabotage teams. When Ukraine destroyed Russian ammunition and fuel depots behind the front lines using HIMARS batteries, this did not merely cause a few days' delay. It collapsed the entire intertwined structure of the system. It is now nearly impossible to safely transport weapons from Moscow to Donetsk. Most of the units on the front lines have been forced to abandon their positions due to shortages of ammunition and food. Some did not even fight. They surrendered simply to survive. The breakdown in the military command chain is another dimension of this crisis. Over the past 2 years, Putin has dismissed 7 different army commanders. Their replacements were chosen not for their combat experience, but for their loyalty to the Kremlin. However, what is needed on the front lines is not loyalty, but tactical intelligence and flexibility. This command chaos has led to different units in the same area conducting operations without communicating with each other, and even firing on each other. In at least 12 friendly fire incidents, Russian troops destroyed their own vehicles and Allied soldiers. One such incident involved North Korean soldiers mistakenly opening fire on Chechen troops because Russian commanders had instructed them to treat all Ukrainians as enemies. The moral collapse is now unstoppable. The war has lost all meaning for Russian soldiers. 3 out of every 10 soldiers on the front lines have either been disciplined or attempted to desert. Operations carried out by Interior Ministry units under the guise of maintaining control on the front lines have turned into a manhunt for deserters. Soldiers are hungry, exhausted, and leaderless. Instead of operational orders, decisions are often made by unauthorized individuals at the sergeant level. In some cases, units do not even have maps. Soldiers do not know why they are fighting or where they are going. The psychological effects are even more devastating. According to internal reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense, 45% of soldiers returning from the front lines are showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Of these, 18% are exhibiting violent tendencies toward their fellow soldiers or civilians. Many turn to crime or commit suicide upon returning home. The 37% increase in suicides in Russia over the past 2 years is said to be directly linked to frontline experience. The Kremlin is trying to hide these figures. However, social media channels, the cries of mothers, the confessions of deserting soldiers, and the occupancy rates of regional hospitals tell a different story. One of the most striking examples occurred at the Kursk front. 70% of Russian troops are not receiving regular meals. Soldiers in the trenches are trying to survive on frozen canned food and stale bread. Freezing incidents during the winter months are resulting in deaths due to the inadequacy of the medical evacuation system. While an average of 40 evacuations could be carried out daily in the first year of the war, this number has now dropped to as low as 6. The reason is the lack of sufficient ambulances and Ukraine's targeting of Russia's rear supply routes with drones. In other words, they are not only fighting the enemy, but also nature and starvation. On the other hand, Ukraine's technological superiority is accelerating this collapse. Currently, an average of 600 FPV attack drones are deployed every day. These unmanned aerial vehicles are low cost but highly effective. A Russian tank or howitzer can be destroyed by an FPV costing an average of $5,000. In contrast, Moscow's air defense system is often unable to detect these drones. Radars are inadequate, software is outdated, and drone countering electronic warfare systems are either insufficient or completely disabled. The integration of Ukraine's defense industry with the West's AI-enabled targeting systems has made it virtually impossible for Russia to continue fighting with 1980s technology. In such an environment, North Korean soldiers, who have emerged as Putin's saviors, are exacerbating the problem rather than solving it. Russian commanders are forced to train the newly arrived North Korean troops, but there are neither the people nor the time to do so. These soldiers also have internal compatibility issues. Different languages, different training, different disciplinary approaches within the same battalion. This eliminates not only coordination on the front lines, but also the chance of survival.
The economic front has also been hit. The Signal plant's annual revenue target was $720 million, with a quarter of that coming from coastal security radar components intended for export. But the burning of critical equipment will disrupt export deadlines and put pressure on Kret's credit lines. According to VTB Bank's internal assessment, at least $140 million in foreign currency is needed to import new equipment. This is no small additional expense for Moscow's war budget. Before the Stavropol attack, the ruble-dollar exchange rate was at 112. Within the 3-hour window, when the news leaked to the Moscow Stock Exchange, the ruble experienced its fastest daily decline and approached 117. There were no foreign investors left. The real panic was felt by secondary industries whose managers had to pay foreign currency advances for machines with foreign components. In other words, Signal was not just a military facility. It was a factory that injected foreign currency into the regional economy. The fire was put out, and the foreign currency tap dried up. The local government in the Stavropol region noted in its annual report that the factory directly employed 3,000 people and created 11,000 indirect jobs. When production stops, these people will not lose their wages, but they will be forced to accept a drop in their minimum wage. The wheels of the local retail chains slow down. Banks are forced to add exceptions for deferring short-term loan payments. Looking at the supply chain, another area where Russia is under pressure is high-frequency ferrite cores. These cores can be printed in another city via a subcontractor in Belarus, but production time is 3 months at best. In the meantime, there are no new jammers or anti-drone systems to send to the front. This gap seems to be an invitation for Ukraine to accelerate its deep strike strategy. This is because Kiev planners know that 2 of the 6 critical raw material facilities they have identified are linked to the Signal factory. They calculate that if a second wave of raids is launched within a few weeks using medium-range unmanned vehicles, repair speeds will not be able to compensate for production losses. Let's turn back the calendar for a moment and put the Volgograd file on the table. On the same night, 2 hours after Stavropol, a reconnaissance suicide drone crashed into a railway bridge near Volgograd, halting the flow of logistics. That bridge is the main route for heavy equipment from the southern military district to the Rostov line. The Ministry of Transport claimed that it would repair the line within 24 hours, but the first satellite images showed that the sleepers under the rails had collapsed in places. This is the second major blow for the Russian front. With the number of artillery shells in the heart of the front already skyrocketing like textile goods on the stock market in Dhaka, even a 48-hour disruption in vehicle and troop movements could be enough to collapse the defense on the Svatov line. There is only one answer to the question of why Ukraine timed the attack to coincide with the final day of the July storm exercise, to create a distraction. During the exercise, Russian air defense networks are focused on the Black Sea and Baltic directions, and command centers are occupied with virtual threats as per the scenario. As a result, internal frontline workshops like Stavropol dropped to low-priority status on radar screens. The UJ-26 platform, with its desert yellow fiberglass hull, can evade operators' eyes because it emits such a small signature that it causes point clutter even in the S-400's L-band scan during night flights. This is why the high PRF low RCS alarm code of the radar signal processors did not sound, and when it did, it was confused with exercise traffic. Moscow plans to fix this mistake with new software patches, but the real solution is a thermal optical multi-sensor array and fighter helicopter pairing, which have remained on paper due to budget and personnel constraints. From a strategic perspective, a critical question remains: can Moscow relocate signal to another region? Theoretically, yes. It could be relocated to the Kazan or Nizhny Novgorod regions. However, the answer to this question becomes increasingly complex because access to high-precision Japanese servo motors is restricted due to sanctions. Additionally, there is no supply chain to procure the 3-axis laser cutting machines that Japan has halted. The micron tolerance of replacement machines from China cannot meet the standards required for Signal's radar PCBs. Therefore, even if production were to resume, it is estimated that it would not perform as well as before. In the geopolitical context, Western capitals have also begun to view this attack as a window of opportunity. A briefing leaked from the UK Ministry of Defence stated that Russian S-400 radar emissions observed over the Black Sea had fallen by 33% in the last 4 days. Electronic silence means defence for Russia and a reconnaissance paradise for NATO. RQ-4 Global Hawk patrol flights have begun to penetrate deeper into the northern coast of the Black Sea. The Cambia Terzi base in Romania has reintroduced the Wild Weasel mission profile, supported by F-16s, into its training schedule. This is a southern reflection of the domino theory remembered from the Kaliningrad could fall within hours debate at the beginning of July. The Black Sea basin is narrowing, and while Russian electronic eyes are shining, they now have to make do with a limited field of vision. Let's say that despite all this, the Kremlin broke its silence and decided to retaliate. The most reasonable countermeasure would be to send a new drone storm to Kiev or rain caliber missiles on the Carpathian bridges. But here too, the cycle bites its own tail. The maintenance kits for the Gearef radars in Krasnodar were also sourced from Signal's burned-out stock. Until new kits arrive, range detection accuracy will decline, meaning incoming missiles will be more vulnerable en route. We have already seen that Sky Sentinel towers are backing up Patriot batteries in Ukraine's lower air defense layer. Cheap AI towers stand guard day and night around Belaya Surkov, giving flexibility to shift missiles earmarked for caliber from Patriot to Iris-T. So Russia strikes, Ukraine hits back with cheaper countermeasures, and the balance does not shift in Moscow's favor. The answer to the question of why Ukraine's deep strike doctrine is changing the nature of the war is as follows. The tension that began in 2014, with tank and artillery fire along the Donbass front line, turned into a frontline collapse with the 2022 general invasion. And since the end of 2024, the ammunition stockpiles and electronic warfare capabilities of both sides have been determining the outcome. Cutting off signals is as critical as depleting ammunition. When factories like Signal are destroyed, it's not the number of soldiers that decreases, but the jammer frequency table. This reduction directly increases the likelihood of artillery rockets hitting their targets. That's why the Stavropol attack was not a small-scale strike, but a strategic blow that created the perception of an army that has lost its signal. Ultimately, it appears that Ukraine's drone fleet is no longer targeting frontline objectives, but rather the systemic nerve centers behind the front lines. This strategy achieves the same psychological and logistical impact without depleting high-cost cruise missile stocks. The shutdown of the signal factory in Stavropol will disrupt Russia's jammer production for months, leaving soldiers on the front lines deaf and blind. The regional economy will falter, and the Kremlin will feel a gap in its defense line against the outside world. This butterfly effect once again highlights how a small roof section can impact a front stretching thousands of kilometers. It seems that an era of electronic silence has begun, and this silence does not bode well for either Russia's production lines or frontline command centers. What are your thoughts on this matter? Your ideas inspire us. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. NATO is no longer content with drawing borders. It is building a steel wall on top of them. As fifth-generation F-35 jets land in Poland, the sound of their engines echoes in the Kremlin's nerves. Moscow is already losing blood in the war in Ukraine. Now it faces NATO's digital war fortress being built to the east. This is not just a deployment, it is a direct challenge. How long can the Kremlin withstand this power, which is now felt not just at the border, but right on its doorstep? It's not just F-16s landing at Luhansk and Crices air bases anymore. The new sound, approaching the runways, belongs to F-35s. These advanced fighter jets are being deployed to Poland as part of NATO. The F-35s, born in Lockheed Martin hangars, arrived with Dutch and Norwegian cockpit logos. But their destination is NATO's Eastern Shield. The temporary deployment order, signed in The Hague at the beginning of July, was initially perceived by diplomatic circles as a routine exercise maneuver. However, every defense analyst who delved into the details noticed the structural transformation underlying the temporary designation. The official calendar says that 12 F-35As of the Royal Netherlands Air Force will be sent to the 32nd base in Luhansk from September 1st to December 1st, and 6 aircraft belonging to the Royal Norwegian Air Force will be sent to Crices for Baltic air policing duties. The details are even more intriguing. Once the rotation is complete, these aircraft will be replaced by Danish and then Italian platforms. This means that at least one fleet of fifth-generation jets will be maintained in a ready alert status in Polish airspace every day of the year. The F-35 is not just a fighter jet, it is a system that can transform into a command and control center in a digital warfare environment, evade radar systems with its low visibility, and maximize its chances of survival in multi-threat environments. When compared to previous generation platforms like the F-16 or Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-35's greatest advantage is its ability to establish an invisible digital network among allied countries through real-time data sharing enabled by sensor fusion. The F-35's mission spectrum covers a wide range of areas, including air superiority, electronic warfare, precision-guided strikes, reconnaissance, and intelligence. Whatever threat is on the battlefield, the F-35 has an answer. The Polish Ministry of Defense began preparing this infrastructure nearly a decade ago. Closed hangars that once housed Soviet MiG-29s have been converted into climate-controlled cells suitable for the F-35's low-visibility coating. Faraday cages have been installed to prevent data leakage in the electromagnetic environment, and runway lighting has been updated to meet the requirements of the sensitive infrared landing profile. But the real investment is in radar. Poland already had 2 Patriot PAK-3 MSE batteries and a domestically produced Pilixa short-range gun missile hybrid. When the Giraffe 4A search radar, purchased from Sweden by the end of 2024, was deployed to close the Patriot's sector blind spot, a full 360-degree Link 16 environment was established for the first time at the NATO Integration Center. When the F-35's sensor fusion was integrated into this network, the land, air, and cyber layers converged on a single screen. A pilot in a Norwegian cockpit tracks a Belarusian unmanned aerial vehicle flying over the Suwalki corridor in real time and sends a tag to the Warsaw Command Center. The same signal is reflected at the Danish air defense node. From there, it reaches the Aegis processor of an Iver Huitfeldt destroyer patrolling the Baltic Sea, and the chain can be closed with a missile strike. This scenario was unimaginable a decade ago. Now, Polish security radio routinely announces Sigma Link stable, fusion green. What is keeping Moscow awake is not the sound of F-35 engines, but this integrated data network. Because the Russian 152nd Artillery Brigade stationed in the Kaliningrad exclave, which is covered by an access-blocking umbrella of IS-300V4 and S-400 batteries, still uses a command and control network from the 1980s at its center. The system, which has been converted from analog to digital, receives command packets from the Leningrad military district and distributes them to Bastion launch vehicles. But there is a millisecond delay when the data is repackaged. At that moment, the F-35 can switch itself into stealth mode before it becomes a missile and silence the signal on the radar screen. On the Russian operator's screen, a wavy line appears, resembling a one-time interference that might suggest a faulty connection. In reality, that signal is an electronic attack tactic, employed by a lightning jet taking off from Luhansk. In other words, a NATO jet taking off from a Polish runway can infiltrate Kaliningrad's launch kill chain and delay the S-400 launcher's firing authorization. This is why the Baltic sky is foggy for Moscow. Who emerged from the fog? At what altitude are they flying? What are their intentions? Are they alone or in a group? To understand the true scale of the Poland F-35 wall, we need to examine the details a bit more closely. For example, radar SAM integration. Warsaw has divided its surface-to-air defense layer into 3 tiers: Patriot PAC-3 long range, Kam-ER medium range, and Pilica gun missile hybrid close range. At the top, the F-35's APG-81 AESA radar detects the plasma trail emitted from the nose of an Iskander-M ballistic missile 100 kilometers away and transmits it to the Patriot battery below. The Kam-ER battery in the middle can share targets via Link 16 signals, even if they don't touch each other. At the bottom, Pilica draws a microdome with a radius of 10 kilometers. If the Lancet drone enters that dome, automatic cannon fire is activated. This neutralizes Russia's recently tested hit with a ballistic missile and finish with cheap ammunition tactic. Ballistic missiles are caught by Patriot, drones fall in the dome, and the cost of missile defense is not noticeable because the payload is shot down in the air before it can be caught. This arrangement is the Polish version of the philosophy of expensive in quality, cheap in quantity. Poland's F-35 wall is not just an air defense concept, but already a response to Russia's border test flights and air policing missions. In May, following a wave of missile and drone attacks launched by Russia against Ukraine, the Polish armed forces issued an emergency military air alert and scrambled fighter jets. In April, when a Tu-214R signal intelligence aircraft left Kaliningrad airspace over the Baltic Sea and followed a zigzag course toward Gotland Island, 2 F-16s took off from Crices and formed the first interception band. Shortly thereafter, however, the Polish Operations Center decided to include the cyber EW capabilities of the F-35s in such measures. Now, interception means more than just escorting. The pilot in the Lightning cockpit can jam the Russian intelligence aircraft's data transmission frequency using a national jammer set, overload the band, disrupt the image, and send empty packets back to the Russian aircraft. This operation draws its energy from the electronic attack portfolio allocated by all NATO members. All of this is an unpleasant equation for the Kremlin. Russia's "We are here" message is turning into a vulnerability in the signal environment and a risk of data loss. The financial cost of this deterrence layer is a new debate for European voters. A single F-35A costs approximately $83 million for the Polish budget. Poland had already ordered 32 from the US. With the temporary additions from the Netherlands and Norway, the number of aircraft on the runway stands at 2 squadrons, or 24 planes. The annual flight and maintenance cost for a Lightning is estimated at $7.1 million. Thanks to NATO's cost-sharing arrangement, it is claimed that the same aircraft will not burden Poland's treasury alone throughout its operational lifespan. However, the opposition is using the term 3 vampires. That is, the Patriot PAS-3, Abrams M1A2 SPV-3 tanks, and the F-35. The Ministry of Defense responds, "If these aircraft do not arrive, there will be blind spots on the Patriot radar, and our tanks will not be able to advance without coordinates from the aircraft." In short, the bricks of the wall are expensive, but if they are moved, the house behind them will collapse. Moscow's official response is predictably harsh. Threats are flying that, if air activity around Kaliningrad reaches provocative levels, we will take military technical measures. What diplomats call military technical measures usually means moving the Iskander division to Belarus or displaying Caliber missiles from the Baltic Fleet. But the Belarus factor is now more complicated than before. The vanguard of the German 10th Mechanized Division has already begun rotating Leopard tanks at the Rukla base near Vilnius. This is the second curtain closing off the Sochi corridor from the east. While Poland's F-35 wall watches the north, German-Lithuanian landlines block the southern axis. The possibility of opening a land bridge through Belarus is becoming the riskiest move on the table. Moreover, Russia's First Guards tank army has not yet returned to full capacity following heavy losses in February 2022, and personnel shortages are being addressed through voluntary contracts. There is also a motivation issue here. If the Kremlin empties its reserves in Kaliningrad to Belarus, the combat group defending the exclave will be weakened. If it does not fill them, it will not be able to show sufficient force against pressure from the Suwałki corridor. The most critical capability of the F-35 wall against Russia is that it forces Kaliningrad to face the feeling of having its A2AD dome riddled with holes. The S-400 complex in Kaliningrad can launch a 40 N6 radar-guided missile 400 kilometers away in a single shot, but the radar seeker lock is broken by the target's evasive maneuvers. When the F-35's low visibility and electronic jamming package work simultaneously, the radar lock may not be stable, and most of the missiles will lose their target in the terminal phase and destroy themselves. This puts the Russian defense commander in a dilemma between spending his expensive stockpile and remaining passive. If they remain passive, NATO's early warning reconnaissance flights will enter through the front door. If they remain active, the risk of all-out war will escalate. The Kremlin had believed it had resolved this dilemma by playing the tactical nuclear stockpile card. But the F-35 wall is showing that this card may also be a bluff. This is because Poland's tower-type autonomous air defense system is about to achieve the flexibility to detect low-altitude Iskander missile launchers and strike them with a swarm of drones. In other words, the moment the "I'll transfer nuclear warheads and make tactical strikes" argument is put on the table, the point of departure becomes a risk. The next step in Poland's defense doctrine is to transfer the integrated command cloud to the army. The Americans call this the sensor-to-shooter loop. In the electromagnetic spectrum, the target detected by the F-35 is transferred to the Patriot, then to the HIMARS battery, and finally to Turkish kamikaze drones deployed on the ground. At every step, decision-making time is shortened, and within seconds, another strike force can be deployed before enemy ground units receive ammunition. This is why concrete armor panels have been added to radar towers in Russia's Kaliningrad Special Administrative Region in recent months. Underground data lines are being upgraded, and mobile radar trucks are being moved into shelters with sliding roofs. In other words, Moscow is rushing to remove its most valuable sensor clusters from being fixed targets. But no matter how mobile they are, the F-35's passive sensors mark the line as soon as they detect a radar truck broadcasting radio signals and send the information to Allied destroyers at sea. That destroyer then launches an SM-2 missile. The mobile target has only 3 to 5 seconds to escape the fixed missile. There is also a social dimension to this power game. The Polish public has long viewed the Russian threat not as an abstract danger, but as a direct part of life. Even during the winter, when natural gas prices skyrocketed, complaints about energy bills in street interviews were linked to the statement, "There is NATO support against Russian aggression." The arrival of the F-35s is perceived as psychological credit that eases the burden of economic austerity. Yes, they are expensive, but they protect us. Every time the Air Force takes off or lands, it is shared on social media, creating a digital watchdog image in the minds of the young population. NATO is not shy about turning this sympathy into money. Warsaw is receiving a larger-than-expected share of European Defence Fund grants. The only condition is that Polish industry must have at least a 40% share in tenders for Patriot maintenance and repair, F-35 runway renovation, and integrated radar modernization. The Kremlin media is producing its own counter-propaganda. The F-35 does not carry Poland's security, but NATO's nuclear bombs. But the era of information black boxes is over. Polish viewers can read the Kremlin and Pentagon statements simultaneously on their cell phones with English subtitles. This popularity is also shaping Polish politics. Even the opposition coalition is isolating the F-35 issue from budget criticism because polls show that 75% say, yes, we need these planes. However, the uncertainty continues. The Baltic security domino scenario could be triggered by a single incident: a border violation, a false radar signal from a fuel tank fire leading to an F-35 scramble, an early launch error of the S-400 in Kaliningrad, a spiral escalation within seconds. That's why NATO isn't keeping its air policing in full idle mode. Every scramble operates like a drill, with pilots developing reflexes akin to those of World Cup goalkeepers. On screens floating throughout the Warsaw Air Operations Center, live data stretching from Rzeszów to Krosno even tags Kaliningrad's piston engine training aircraft. Because the escalation thread is thin, there is no room for error. The real power of the F-35 wall is kept on alert but not fired unless necessary. When fired, it delivers a single decisive blow, forcing the enemy to recalculate. Moscow's nightmare is precisely this: a system that leaks data, loses signals, wastes expensive missiles, and worst of all, cannot provide a clear answer to the question, what is our response if something heavy comes? As can be seen, Poland is not experiencing a quiet rise. On the contrary, it is undergoing a loud and ambitious military transformation process that is attracting the attention of all of Europe and Moscow. By the end of 2025, Poland will have allocated 4.7% of its gross domestic product to defense spending. This is more than double NATO's target of 2%, and currently the highest among all alliance members, including the US. This figure alone clearly shows that Poland aims to be not just a regional player, but a strategic center of gravity on NATO's eastern flank. Poland's military spending is so extensive and sophisticated that even calling it a shopping spree would be an understatement. This is a full-scale transformation project involving the most advanced technologies on the continent. Some of the systems that have been ordered and are currently being delivered include 32 F-35 Lightning II aircraft, 300 over 500 HIMARS and K-239 Chunmoo multiple rocket launchers, K-2 Black Panther tanks, and K-9 Thunder howitzers. Poland is not only upgrading its equipment, but also transforming its human resources capacity. The number of troops, which reached 180,000 by 2024, is set to increase to 300,000 in the near future. The ultimate goal is a permanent army of 500,000. This number is unmatched not only in Europe but also in many NATO countries. At the same time, structural reforms such as the transition to professional soldiery, the establishment of volunteer reserve units, and the extension of military education down to the high school level are also progressing. Poland now not only has the equipment, but is also building the human resources to use these systems effectively at the tactical level. Let's be honest. Russia may be a superpower, but it is no longer remembered for its armor, but for its wounds. The war in Ukraine is not only a military arena for Russia, but also a grinding machine. Every day, hundreds of soldiers go to the front, but many do not return. According to Western intelligence agencies, Russia has lost more than 1 million people so far, including those killed, wounded, and disabled. Armored units? A country that once boasted of its Soviet tank armies has lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. In some areas, they have even been forced to deploy T-62 tanks from the 1960s. Aircraft losses are also significant. Thanks to Ukraine's air defense systems and modern weapons from the West, hundreds of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft have been shot down or destroyed in their hangars. But there is another front that is just as devastating as the military losses: the economy. The war and sanctions are cutting off Russia's economic lifelines one by one. A system dependent on oil and natural gas exports is now struggling to find markets for its products. High-tech imports have come to a standstill. The banking system has been isolated and the ruble has gone into free fall at times. Defense industry production is faltering due to the embargo, as many critical components, from chips to bearings, came from the West. Domestically, the situation is more complex. A significant portion of the young population is either at the front or has left the country. While large segments of society are quietly shouldering the burden of this war, the official rhetoric of the state continues to be one of victory. But in reality, cracks are widening within the Kremlin, morale is flagging within the army, and the system is becoming increasingly fragile. In short, Poland's long history of being seen as nothing more than a buffer zone, a transit corridor, or a geopolitical obstacle caught between two powers is now a thing of the past. Today's Poland is no longer just a country defending its borders, but an independent military power, playing a key role in the European security architecture. This new Poland is not only present on the battlefield with tanks, jets and missiles, but also with its determination, investments in the defense industry, and claims to regional leadership. This is precisely why, for those in the Kremlin who still draw maps in Soviet colors, Warsaw is no longer just a capital city. It is a serious threat that disrupts plans, confuses calculations, and refuses to bow to intimidation. Poland is no longer a wall in Europe's security architecture. It is a cornerstone, and this cornerstone has no intention of moving from its place. Thank you for watching. NATO is no longer content with drawing borders. It is building a steel wall on top of them. As fifth-generation F-35 jets land in Poland, the sound of their engines echoes in the Kremlin's nerves. Moscow is already losing blood in the war in Ukraine. Now it faces NATO's digital war fortress being built to the east. This is not just a deployment, it is a direct challenge. How long can the Kremlin withstand this power, which is now felt not just at the border, but right on its doorstep? It's not just F-16s landing at Luhansk and crisis air bases anymore. The new sound, approaching the runways, belongs to F-35s. These advanced fighter jets are being deployed to Poland as part of NATO. The F-35s, born in Lockheed Martin hangars, arrived with Dutch and Norwegian cockpit logos. But their destination is NATO's Eastern Shield. The temporary deployment order, signed in The Hague at the beginning of July, was initially perceived by diplomatic circles as a routine exercise maneuver. However, every defense analyst who delved into the details noticed the structural transformation underlying the temporary designation. The official calendar says that 12 F-35As of the Royal Netherlands Air Force will be sent to the 32nd base in Luhansk from September 1st to December 1st, and 6 aircraft belonging to the Royal Norwegian Air Force will be sent to crisis for Baltic air policing duties. The details are even more intriguing. Once the rotation is complete, these aircraft will be replaced by Danish and then Italian platforms. This means that at least one fleet of fifth-generation jets will be maintained in a ready alert status in Polish airspace every day of the year. The F-35 is not just a fighter jet, it is a system that can transform into a command and control center in a digital warfare environment, evade radar systems with its low visibility, and maximize its chances of survival in multi-threat environments. When compared to previous generation platforms like the F-16 or Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-35's greatest advantage is its ability to establish an invisible digital network among allied countries through real-time data sharing enabled by sensor fusion. The F-35's mission spectrum covers a wide range of areas, including air superiority, electronic warfare, precision-guided strikes, reconnaissance, and intelligence. Whatever threat is on the battlefield, the F-35 has an answer. The Polish Ministry of Defense began preparing this infrastructure nearly a decade ago. Closed hangars that once housed Soviet MiG-29s have been converted into climate-controlled cells suitable for the F-35's low-visibility coating. Faraday cages have been installed to prevent data leakage in the electromagnetic environment, and runway lighting has been updated to meet the requirements of the sensitive infrared landing profile. But the real investment is in radar. Poland already had 2 Patriot PAK-3 MSE batteries and a domestically produced Pilixa short-range gun missile hybrid. When the Giraffe 4A search radar, purchased from Sweden by the end of 2024, was deployed to close the Patriot's sector blind spot, a full 360-degree Link 16 environment was established for the first time at the NATO Integration Center. When the F-35's sensor fusion was integrated into this network, the land, air, and cyber layers converged on a single screen. A pilot in a Norwegian cockpit tracks a Belarusian unmanned aerial vehicle flying over the Suwalki corridor in real time and sends a tag to the Warsaw Command Center. The same signal is reflected at the Danish air defense node. From there, it reaches the Aegis processor of an Iver Huitfeldt destroyer patrolling the Baltic Sea, and the chain can be closed with a missile strike. This scenario was unimaginable a decade ago. Now, Polish security radio routinely announces Sigma Link stable, fusion green. What is keeping Moscow awake is not the sound of F-35 engines, but this integrated data network. Because the Russian 152nd Artillery Brigade stationed in the Kaliningrad exclave, which is covered by an access-blocking umbrella of IS-300V4 and S-400 batteries, still uses a command and control network from the 1980s at its center. The system, which has been converted from analog to digital, receives command packets from the Leningrad military district and distributes them to Bastion launch vehicles. But there is a millisecond delay when the data is repackaged. At that moment, the F-35 can switch itself into stealth mode before it becomes a missile and silence the signal on the radar screen. On the Russian operator's screen, a wavy line appears, resembling a one-time interference that might suggest a faulty connection. In reality, that signal is an electronic attack tactic employed by a Lightning jet taking off from Luhansk. In other words, a NATO jet taking off from a Polish runway can infiltrate Kaliningrad's launch kill chain and delay the S-400 launcher's firing authorization. This is why the Baltic sky is foggy for Moscow. Who emerged from the fog? At what altitude are they flying? What are their intentions? Are they alone or in a group? To understand the true scale of the Poland F-35 wall, we need to examine the details a bit more closely. For example, radar SAM integration. Warsaw has divided its surface-to-air defense layer into 3 tiers: Patriot PAC-3 long range, Kam-ER medium range, and Pilica gun missile hybrid close range. At the top, the F-35's APG-81 AESA radar detects the plasma trail emitted from the nose of an Iskander-M ballistic missile 100 kilometers away and transmits it to the Patriot battery below. The Kam-ER battery in the middle can share targets via Link 16 signals, even if they don't touch each other. At the bottom, Pilica draws a microdome with a radius of 10 kilometers. If the Lancet drone enters that dome, automatic cannon fire is activated. This neutralizes Russia's recently tested hit with a ballistic missile and finish with cheap ammunition tactic. Ballistic missiles are caught by Patriot, drones fall in the dome, and the cost of missile defense is not noticeable because the payload is shot down in the air before it can be caught. This arrangement is the Polish version of the philosophy of expensive in quality, cheap in quantity. Poland's F-35 wall is not just an air defense concept, but already a response to Russia's border test flights and air policing missions. In May, following a wave of missile and drone attacks launched by Russia against Ukraine, the Polish armed forces issued an emergency military air alert and scrambled fighter jets. In April, when a Tu-214R signal intelligence aircraft left Kaliningrad airspace over the Baltic Sea and followed a zigzag course toward Gotland Island, 2 F-16s took off from Crices and formed the first interception band. Shortly thereafter, however, the Polish Operations Center decided to include the cyber EW capabilities of the F-35s in such measures. Now, interception means more than just escorting. The pilot in the Lightning cockpit can jam the Russian intelligence aircraft's data transmission frequency using a national jammer set, overload the band, disrupt the image, and send empty packets back to the Russian aircraft. This operation draws its energy from the electronic attack portfolio allocated by all NATO members. All of this is an unpleasant equation for the Kremlin. Russia's "We are here" message is turning into a vulnerability in the signal environment and a risk of data loss. The financial cost of this deterrence layer is a new debate for European voters. A single F-35A costs approximately $83 million for the Polish budget. Poland had already ordered 32 from the US. With the temporary additions from the Netherlands and Norway, the number of aircraft on the runway stands at 2 squadrons, or 24 planes. The annual flight and maintenance cost for a Lightning is estimated at $7.1 million. Thanks to NATO's cost-sharing arrangement, it is claimed that the same aircraft will not burden Poland's treasury alone throughout its operational lifespan. However, the opposition is using the term 3 vampires. That is, the Patriot PAS-3, Abrams M1A2 SPV-3 tanks, and the F-35. The Ministry of Defense responds, "If these aircraft do not arrive, there will be blind spots on the Patriot radar, and our tanks will not be able to advance without coordinates from the aircraft." In short, the bricks of the wall are expensive, but if they are moved, the house behind them will collapse. Moscow's official response is predictably harsh. Threats are flying that, if air activity around Kaliningrad reaches provocative levels, we will take military technical measures. What diplomats call military technical measures usually means moving the Iskander division to Belarus or displaying Caliber missiles from the Baltic Fleet. But the Belarus factor is now more complicated than before. The vanguard of the German 10th Mechanized Division has already begun rotating Leopard tanks at the Rukla base near Vilnius. This is the second curtain closing off the Sochi corridor from the east. While Poland's F-35 wall watches the north, German-Lithuanian landlines block the southern axis. The possibility of opening a land bridge through Belarus is becoming the riskiest move on the table. Moreover, Russia's First Guards tank army has not yet returned to full capacity following heavy losses in February 2022, and personnel shortages are being addressed through voluntary contracts. There is also a motivation issue here. If the Kremlin empties its reserves in Kaliningrad to Belarus, the combat group defending the exclave will be weakened. If it does not fill them, it will not be able to show sufficient force against pressure from the Suwałki corridor. The most critical capability of the F-35 wall against Russia is that it forces Kaliningrad to face the feeling of having its A2AD dome riddled with holes. The S-400 complex in Kaliningrad can launch a 40 N6 radar-guided missile 400 kilometers away in a single shot, but the radar seeker lock is broken by the target's evasive maneuvers. When the F-35's low visibility and electronic jamming package work simultaneously, the radar lock may not be stable, and most of the missiles will lose their target in the terminal phase and destroy themselves. This puts the Russian defense commander in a dilemma between spending his expensive stockpile and remaining passive. If they remain passive, NATO's early warning reconnaissance flights will enter through the front door. If they remain active, the risk of all-out war will escalate. The Kremlin had believed it had resolved this dilemma by playing the tactical nuclear stockpile card. But the F-35 wall is showing that this card may also be a bluff. This is because Poland's tower-type autonomous air defense system is about to achieve the flexibility to detect low-altitude Iskander missile launchers and strike them with a swarm of drones. In other words, the moment the "I'll transfer nuclear warheads and make tactical strikes" argument is put on the table, the point of departure becomes a risk. The next step in Poland's defense doctrine is to transfer the integrated command cloud to the army. The Americans call this the sensor-to-shooter loop. In the electromagnetic spectrum, the target detected by the F-35 is transferred to the Patriot, then to the HIMARS battery, and finally to Turkish kamikaze drones deployed on the ground. At every step, decision-making time is shortened, and within seconds, another strike force can be deployed before enemy ground units receive ammunition. This is why concrete armor panels have been added to radar towers in Russia's Kaliningrad Special Administrative Region in recent months. Underground data lines are being upgraded, and mobile radar trucks are being moved into shelters with sliding roofs. In other words, Moscow is rushing to remove its most valuable sensor clusters from being fixed targets. But no matter how mobile they are, the F-35's passive sensors mark the line as soon as they detect a radar truck broadcasting radio signals and send the information to Allied destroyers at sea. That destroyer then launches an SM-2 missile. The mobile target has only 3 to 5 seconds to escape the fixed missile. There is also a social dimension to this power game. The Polish public has long viewed the Russian threat not as an abstract danger, but as a direct part of life. Even during the winter, when natural gas prices skyrocketed, complaints about energy bills in street interviews were linked to the statement, "There is NATO support against Russian aggression." The arrival of the F-35s is perceived as psychological credit that eases the burden of economic austerity. Yes, they are expensive, but they protect us. Every time the Air Force takes off or lands, it is shared on social media, creating a digital watchdog image in the minds of the young population. NATO is not shy about turning this sympathy into money. Warsaw is receiving a larger than expected share of European Defence Fund grants. The only condition is that Polish industry must have at least a 40% share in tenders for Patriot maintenance and repair, F-35 runway renovation, and integrated radar modernization. The Kremlin media is producing its own counter-propaganda. The F-35 does not carry Poland's security, but NATO's nuclear bombs. But the era of information black boxes is over. Polish viewers can read the Kremlin and Pentagon statements simultaneously on their cell phones with English subtitles. This popularity is also shaping Polish politics. Even the opposition coalition is isolating the F-35 issue from budget criticism because polls show that 75% say, yes, we need these planes. However, the uncertainty continues. The Baltic security domino scenario could be triggered by a single incident: a border violation, a false radar signal from a fuel tank fire leading to an F-35 scramble, an early launch error of the S-400 in Kaliningrad, a spiral escalation within seconds. That's why NATO isn't keeping its air policing in full idle mode. Every scramble operates like a drill, with pilots developing reflexes akin to those of World Cup goalkeepers. On screens floating throughout the Warsaw Air Operations Center, live data stretching from Rzeszów to Krosno even tags Kaliningrad's piston-engine training aircraft. Because the escalation thread is thin, there is no room for error. The real power of the F-35 wall is kept on alert but not fired unless necessary. When fired, it delivers a single decisive blow, forcing the enemy to recalculate. Moscow's nightmare is precisely this: a system that leaks data, loses signals, wastes expensive missiles, and worst of all, cannot provide a clear answer to the question, what is our response if something heavy comes? As can be seen, Poland is not experiencing a quiet rise. On the contrary, it is undergoing a loud and ambitious military transformation process that is attracting the attention of all of Europe and Moscow. By the end of 2025, Poland will have allocated 4.7% of its gross domestic product to defense spending. This is more than double NATO's target of 2%, and currently the highest among all alliance members, including the US. This figure alone clearly shows that Poland aims to be not just a regional player, but a strategic center of gravity on NATO's eastern flank. Poland's military spending is so extensive and sophisticated that even calling it a shopping spree would be an understatement. This is a full-scale transformation project involving the most advanced technologies on the continent. Some of the systems that have been ordered and are currently being delivered include 32 F-35 Lightning II aircraft, 300 over 500 HIMARS and K-239 Chunmoo multiple rocket launchers, K-2 Black Panther tanks, and K-9 Thunder howitzers. Poland is not only upgrading its equipment, but also transforming its human resources capacity. The number of troops, which reached 180,000 by 2024, is set to increase to 300,000 in the near future. The ultimate goal is a permanent army of 500,000. This number is unmatched not only in Europe, but also in many NATO countries. At the same time, structural reforms such as the transition to professional soldiery, the establishment of volunteer reserve units, and the extension of military education down to the high school level are also progressing. Poland now not only has the equipment, but is also building the human resources to use these systems effectively at the tactical level. Let's be honest. Russia may be a superpower, but it is no longer remembered for its armor, but for its wounds. The war in Ukraine is not only a military arena for Russia, but also a grinding machine. Every day, hundreds of soldiers go to the front, but many do not return. According to Western intelligence agencies, Russia has lost more than 1 million people so far, including those killed, wounded, and disabled. Armored units? A country that once boasted of its Soviet tank armies has lost thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. In some areas, they have even been forced to deploy T-62 tanks from the 1960s. Aircraft losses are also significant. Thanks to Ukraine's air defense systems and modern weapons from the West, hundreds of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft have been shot down or destroyed in their hangars. But there is another front that is just as devastating as the military losses: the economy. The war and sanctions are cutting off Russia's economic lifelines one by one. A system dependent on oil and natural gas exports is now struggling to find markets for its products. High-tech imports have come to a standstill. The banking system has been isolated and the ruble has gone into free fall at times. Defense industry production is faltering due to the embargo, as many critical components, from chips to bearings, came from the West. Domestically, the situation is more complex. A significant portion of the young population is either at the front or has left the country. While large segments of society are quietly shouldering the burden of this war, the official rhetoric of the state continues to be one of victory. But in reality, cracks are widening within the Kremlin, morale is flagging within the army, and the system is becoming increasingly fragile. In short, Poland's long history of being seen as nothing more than a buffer zone, a transit corridor, or a geopolitical obstacle caught between two powers is now a thing of the past. Today's Poland is no longer just a country defending its borders, but an independent military power, playing a key role in the European security architecture. This new Poland is not only present on the battlefield with tanks, jets and missiles, but also with its determination, investments in the defense industry, and claims to regional leadership. This is precisely why, for those in the Kremlin who still draw maps in Soviet colors, Warsaw is no longer just a capital city. It is a serious threat that disrupts plans, confuses calculations, and refuses to bow to intimidation. Poland is no longer a wall in Europe's security architecture. It is a cornerstone, and this cornerstone has no intention of moving from its place. Thank you for watching. Let's Side. Supply lines in the Belgorod and Graveron regions are constantly under drone attack. Fuel and ammunition convoys are being destroyed before they reach the front lines. This is pushing Russian forces on the Sumy line into a serious logistical crisis. However, despite the stability in casualties, such a large loss of territory points to another problem. The Kremlin is not sending reinforcements. More accurately, it does not want to send them. This is because there are those who believe that plans to open a new front, or the current southern defense, are a higher priority. Military planners in Kyiv are closely monitoring these developments. The fall of Oleksiivka, following Kindrativka and Andriivka, would shift the 30-kilometer defense line along the Sumy axis in Ukraine's favor. Moreover, this area is only 18 kilometers from the border crossing of the railway line leading directly to Belgorod. If Ukrainian forces reach this depth, Russia's logistical transfers from the north to the inner lines of the front will be paralyzed. However, satellite images cast doubt on this claim. Tanks were left abandoned on the so-called rotation route, and personnel had scattered into the forest. Neither regular nor controlled. ISW's rapid analysis also revealed another shortcoming. The retreating column had left its logistics convoys on the same route defenseless, so the escape was not merely tactical, it was dragging logistics into chaos. The most heavily targeted point of the supply tunnel stretching from Belgorod to Sumy is a 3-kilometer stretch of forest-shaded road. Ukrainian drone pilots are not tracking thermal signatures. They are targeting the contours of the tanker's hull, not the engine's heat. Hiding such a simple signature is nearly impossible. That's why the Russian side deployed camouflage nets and mobile jammers. But the jammers' energy requirements created a separate fuel line. The generators attached to the courier trucks couldn't reach the target area on the day of the attack. It's a vicious cycle. You need fuel to bring fuel, and when you can't replace the fuel you've used, the cycle stops. Ukraine's advance in Sumy may seem like a small, unmarked road on a military map. However, when the factor of moral decay is taken into account, it becomes enormous. Strategists in Kiev say that, by the end of summer, the targeted encirclement will leave 50,000 troops gasping for breath. Is this number exaggerated? Perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 will retreat, and 10,000 will surrender. But what matters is not the cost of bringing back the survivors, but the cost of the tanks, artillery, and equipment left behind. Russia claimed to have 3,000 active tanks at the start of the war, but the number of modern tanks currently seen on the battlefield is less than 1,000. When even T-55s are being pulled out of storage to make up for losses, the motivation to fight is hitting rock bottom. This is what Ukraine wants: to cut off the economic and psychological sinews of war of its opponent. The morale of Ukrainian troops on the front lines has not been this high in a long time. Commanders are no longer trying to push back armored brigades. They are organizing the safe surrender of crews inside armored vehicles that have raised the white flag. The breakdown of Russia's logistics network in Sumy is sending a delayed shockwave to Donbass, because when fuel and ammunition supplies from the north run out, the train schedule for replenishing the artillery stocks used in the south is disrupted. Russia's possible response boils down to two options. Either it will slow down the southern offensive to pump fuel and ammunition back to the northern front, or it will establish a partial bypass from depots in Belarus to the northern front. The first option would buy time for Donbass. The second would cast doubt on Belarus's claim of neutrality. Vladimir Putin needs a new round of mobilization to maintain troop levels in Ukraine. Every desertion is like cutting off one of the Moscow army's lifelines. The road ahead for Ukraine is now much clearer. The task ahead is not only to gain territory, but to systematically deplete Russia's economic and military resources. The main goal is to turn Russia's long war strategy against itself. To this end, Ukraine has three main priorities. First, to maintain or increase casualty rates at current levels. In recent weeks, Russia has been suffering around 8,000 casualties per week, and this number has begun to shake the Kremlin's personnel cycle. As long as Ukraine maintains this level, Russia's efforts to find soldiers will become even more difficult. The front lines that Moscow is trying to fill with its volunteer contract system will soon collapse in terms of both manpower and morale. The second priority is to expand deep strike capabilities. Attacks should be increased not only on the front lines, but also on logistics, command and production centers within Russia. Military industrial facilities, ammunition depots, railway junctions and fuel stocks in regions such as Rostov, Belgorod, Voronezh, Bryansk and Kursk should become priority targets for Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles and sabotage teams. This strategy is the most effective way to shape Russia from within. The third and most critical task is to target everything that is expensive. This is because Russia has already shifted to a full-fledged war economy. However, although this economy appears strong from the outside, it is experiencing serious problems in obtaining sensitive parts, semiconductors, optical sensors, and modern equipment due to Western sanctions. In short, there is no shortage of targets. When Ukraine systematically takes these high-cost targets out of commission, Russia will collapse not only on the battlefield, but also in its defense industry. The situation developing in favor of Ukraine on the Sumy axis has now gained irreversible momentum. The liberation of Kindrativka and Andriivka, and the complete encirclement of Oleksiivka, show that Ukraine is on the verge of gaining strategic control in the north. If Oleksiivka falls, Ukraine will have completely eliminated the direct threat around Sumy. This means a new window of opportunity. What's next? Commander Syrsky's next target is increasingly likely to be Vovchansk. This region, located in the northeast of the Kharkiv Oblast, is still under Russian control. However, it is of high strategic importance. Both the connection line with Belgorod and the front-line support towards Kupiansk converge here. Recapturing Vovchansk could collapse Russia's entire defensive depth in the Kharkiv region. Moreover, the psychological importance of Kharkiv cannot be overlooked. Partially occupied in 2022 and later liberated by Ukraine's rapid offensive, this region remains a matter of pride for Russia. The fall of Vovchansk would shatter the Kremlin's perception that we can at least hold on to what we've taken. We don't want to leave you hanging with all this information. In your opinion, how will the Kremlin try to cover up this logistical balloon that exploded in Sumy? A longer war or a new retreat plan behind closed doors? Whatever your thoughts, we look forward to discussing them in the comments. And if you don't want to miss these pivotal moments, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because in the coming weeks, new stories, stretching from the Sumy forests to the Kursk deadlock, will continue to track not the pulse of the war, but the pulse of strategy. Thank you for watching.
As of the beginning of July, gross foreign exchange and gold reserves stood at $580 billion. But when the frozen G7 tranche and gold reserves are excluded, the real liquid buffer falls to $150 billion. About a quarter of this amount is used to service external debt, which requires quarterly payments. Investor demand for ruble bonds issued by the Treasury at the end of May was 40% lower than expected, and interest rates climbed to 15.5%. High interest rates are making public spending more expensive, making it harder for Putin to maintain the balance of his 2025 defense social package. As can be seen from this, each attack was more sophisticated. Each unmanned aerial vehicle was more accurate. Each target was more vital. And now, this is no longer just a regional event. It is a systemic event. Tatneft, Gazprom, Neft, Rosneft, Lukoil, none of them were spared. These are not backyard facilities. These are facilities that form the heart of Russia's fuel economy, powering everything from internal transportation to frontline logistics. With its refineries offline, Russia is facing a situation it hasn't encountered since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yes, as you might expect, fuel imports. The world's second largest energy exporter, with the largest natural gas reserves and the third largest oil production capacity, is importing gasoline from Belarus and Kazakhstan to keep its civilian market afloat. The consequences are evident everywhere. Gasoline prices have risen by 30% in Voronezh. Diesel restrictions have begun in Kurgan. Farmers in Tambov are parking their tractors because they cannot afford to run them. Even military depots in Rostov have reported tactical fuel shortages, and armored convoys have been delayed for days. The effects are immediately felt at the front. Russian mechanized units, which used to change shifts every 72 hours, are now holding their positions for twice as long and waiting for fuel. A motorized division burns 350,000 liters of diesel fuel on a day of intense fighting. The 30% reduction in fuel deliveries to the front from Ilski amounts to approximately 36,000 MWAS barrels, which theoretically means fuel rationing for 12 motorized divisions, or 4 heavy armored corps. Filling this gap by train from the Ufa and Omsk refineries doubles freight costs and extends the length of the rail line vulnerable to attack. Ukrainian railway sabotage teams have been sabotaging relay cabinets on the Kursk-Voronezh line since May. As the number of fuel wagons increases, so does the density of soft targets. Logistical tensions are pushing Russian command centers toward a schedule of rationing supplies and fuel rather than accelerating operational plans. The pace of armored follow-up attacks on the ground is slowing, while the duration of fire missions assigned to artillery batteries is shortening. Helicopter fleets are unable to fly due to the deterioration or unavailability of aviation-grade kerosene. Jet fuel deliveries to air bases in Crimea have been cut off. Russia's entire southern logistics command is literally running on its last drop of fuel. But the effects extend beyond battlefield logistics. They are reaching the social fabric of the Russian Federation. For months, Kremlin propagandists have been promising citizens that the war is being fought elsewhere, far from their homes, as a geopolitical chess match. This illusion is now burning along with the refinery towers. Videos of fuel lines stretching for miles, viral posts showing the darkened skies over bombed industrial parks, and leaked footage of regional governors begging Moscow for emergency fuel shipments. All of this is showing the public that the war has come to their doorstep. The erosion of energy revenues is also shaking up the Kremlin's internal political equation. Russia's budget still relies on oil and gas taxes. Non-energy revenue is stuck at 38%. War spending eats up a third of total budget expenditures. When oil prices fall, this spending creates a financing gap. The Putin administration is turning to the National Wealth Fund to close the gap. However, the amount of liquid ruble-denominated foreign assets in the fund fell to $32 billion in the February update. Various bank reports imply that the actual cash is less than half of that. As the liquid buffer approaches a critical threshold, the Kremlin's ability to buy elite support narrows. Oligarch capital shifts from rubles to foreign currency. Capital outflows accelerate, the ruble weakens, and a vicious cycle begins. A $5 per barrel revenue shock alone creates a budget shortfall of hundreds of billions of rubles. This shortfall reached 700 billion rubles in the first half of the year. The Ministry of Economy hinted at cuts in non-essential spending in its August revision. Support for higher education, regional infrastructure projects, and even pension increases are on the table. Such signals of social cuts evoke memories of the mass discontent that followed the 2018 pension reform. The first reflex on the social front is to suppress fuel prices with administrative caps. The Energy Ministry's damper mechanism on retail diesel prices subsidizes the difference between the state and refinery prices. But when refinery costs rise, the subsidy burden on the budget increases. By the end of 2024, the total amount spent on the damper mechanism had already approached 2.3 trillion rubles. And what's worse, the Kremlin cannot fix this. Not in weeks, not in months, perhaps not at all. Because refineries are not just steel and concrete. They consist of software, sensors, and signal controllers, most of which are supplied by Western companies such as Siemens, Honeywell, ABB, and Emerson. Due to sanctions, Russia cannot legally obtain spare parts. Due to the disruption of the supply chain, they cannot even produce black market versions on a large scale. The result is a strategic bottleneck, technological embargoes, and internal brain drain compounded by physical damage. Repair teams are working with outdated schematics. Control centers are operating with software patched together with tape. In one case, a Rosneft facility attempted to install an old SCADA backup system coded in 2003. It failed. The system couldn't interface with modern sensors. The facility is still not operational. So what will Russia do next? The answer: nothing in the short term. Moscow has begun redirecting contracts for refinery reconstruction to local subsidiaries in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. It hopes to circumvent sanctions through companies in the region. But without access to critical imported components, such as filter membranes, catalytic converters, and high-pressure valves, these companies can do little more than make plans they cannot carry out. And even if they succeed, Ukraine's drones are not a static threat. They are evolving. Telemetry is analyzed after every attack. The code is rewritten after every miss. The target list expands with every success. Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicle command has turned into a cycle of destruction. Attack, analyze, improve, repeat. These are not weapons. They are winged algorithms. And they are winning. In military terms, this is called strategic disruption. It's the ability to prevent an enemy from operating on the battlefield. But Ukraine has gone a step further. This isn't just disruption. It's systematic attrition. Russia isn't being stopped. It is slowly bleeding out, mercilessly. And with drone attacks becoming nearly impossible to predict, there is no reliable defense. Russia's current air defense network is optimized for traditional missile threats, not for carbon composite drones flying at 10 meters above the ground with a wingspan of 3 meters. Pantsir batteries are poorly positioned. The S-400 systems are overloaded. Short-range defenses are collapsing. The Kremlin's response so far has been one of helplessness. Regional governors are forming volunteer drone defense brigades. Civil defense forces are being armed with Kalashnikovs and binoculars. In the Leningrad Oblast, residents have been instructed to report any strange buzzing sounds near fuel facilities. This is not a 21st century war. This is the collapse of an empire, broadcast in real time. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to escalate not in size, but in precision. Drone fleets are now integrating real-time satellite imagery, thermal target identification, and AI-assisted attack sequencing capabilities. Targeting is no longer done by people looking at maps, but by autonomous systems analyzing fuel flow patterns, thermal leaks, and sensor anomalies. An unmanned aerial vehicle doesn't just strike a refinery. It strikes the weakest valve, the most flammable tank, the structural weak points. This isn't an attack, it's surgery. And the patient is on the operating table, fighting for its life. Perhaps most importantly, this campaign has fundamentally changed the way we think about economic warfare. For decades, sanctions were the West's supposed tool for punishing rogue states. But sanctions are slow, leaky, and dependent on international consensus. Ukraine's drones are fast, cheap, and unilateral. Every economic blow that the EU spends a month debating is delivered by Ukraine in minutes. This is the digitization of deterrence. The message is clear. You cannot run a war economy without fuel, and you cannot deliver fuel without infrastructure. If that infrastructure cannot be defended, it cannot exist. And if it cannot exist, the war will end not with a treaty, but with starvation. What we are witnessing in the collapse of Russia's refineries is not just a military retreat. It is a system failure. It is a war of attrition that goes beyond the battlefield and strikes at the lifeblood of a superpower. It is a silent campaign aimed not at destroying armies, but at depriving them of the means to feed, move, and survive. Ukraine is not just defending its territory. It is eliminating its capacity. And every attack tells the same story. If you can cut off the fuel supply, you don't need to destroy the machine. Welcome to the war where drones don't just fly. They think, adapt, and destroy empires. A refinery is a refinery. Thank you for watching. A Su-27 vaporized a Russian UAV headquarters in Luhansk in a single sortie. Minutes later, an FPV drone turned a hidden Buk M1 battery into a fireball. Two pinpoint strikes severed the see-and-shoot chain behind the front lines and pushed Moscow's casualty toll to a new high. How does this breakthrough shake Russian strategy and shift the balance of the war? The Ukrainian-made Su-27 soaring over Luhansk was not just an aircraft. It was the steel-winged symbol of resistance in occupied territory. As of the morning of July 9th, the echoes of this Soviet-era fighter jet's precise strike on a target are still reverberating in operational footage. The mission was confirmed by intelligence sources as the destruction of a target, a temporary deployment site for a Russian military drone unit. According to signals received the previous day, a group of Orlan-10 operators, a mobile command vehicle, and several armored personnel carriers had positioned themselves in the area. The target was an old industrial building with a large roof. The structure was being used by Russian forces as a temporary headquarters and ammunition supply point. The flight plan was finalized throughout the night. The approach to the target was conducted at low altitude to minimize radar cross-section. The Su-27 was carrying two high-explosive FAB-250 unguided bombs. The bombs were to be released using a modernized navigation computer and external coordinate fixation. The pilot issued the arm command when the aircraft was 8 kilometers from the final target. The landing gear was retracted and the weapon systems were active. The radar warning receiver was silent. No effective air defense scan was detected in the area. The first bomb was then released. 2 seconds later, the second one followed. The maneuver began with a minimum descent angle of 20 degrees. As the Su-27 climbed, the sound of the explosion was clearly heard by ground stations. Observation drones recorded thick smoke rising from the east wing of the building within seconds. The main structure collapsed shortly thereafter. In the 40 seconds that followed, a second explosion occurred with the detonation of the ammunition stockpile. Thermal images showed that temperatures rose rapidly. The UAV unit was assessed to have been destroyed. According to radio intercept data, there was a brief communication outage in the area after the attack. At least 2 vehicles at the site were rendered unusable, and no evacuation or rescue calls were recorded for personnel inside. The Ukrainian Air Force issued the following statement after the attack. Specifically, our Su-27 successfully struck enemy unmanned aerial vehicles operating in the occupied territories in the Luhansk region and the gathering point of enemy forces. Although almost all of the Luhansk region is under occupation, the resistance continues. Our Air Force will continue to strengthen this resistance and not give the enemy any respite. This operation is significant in several respects. The first is the choice of target. Striking the area where the Russian Army's UAV command and control elements are located means not only physical losses, but also a blow to their observation and guidance capabilities. Timing and intelligence are also important. The attack was timed to coincide with a heavy concentration of personnel and equipment at the target. This shows that Ukraine's intelligence network of sensors and observation in the field is working effectively. The psychological impact is perhaps the most important aspect. The fact that Ukrainian jets are able to operate in a completely controlled area, such as Luhansk, undermines the Russian troops' sense of security. Although the Luhansk region is largely under Russian control, such precision air strikes demonstrate that Ukraine still has a deterrent and reachable force in the region. Immediately after the successful attack targeting UAV operators in Luhansk, precision strikes were also carried out against Russia's air defense infrastructure. The 413th Separate Unmanned Systems Battalion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the 15th Artillery Reconnaissance Brigade, codenamed Black Forest, carried out a joint tactical operation to neutralize a Russian Buk M1 surface-to-air missile battery. The target of the attack was a Buk M1 mobile air defense system that was believed to have been on active duty shortly before. The vehicle had turned onto a forest road while attempting to leave the area after completing its mission. Due to increasing drone attacks, the Russian crew aimed to keep the system hidden among the trees rather than leaving it in an open area to minimize its radar signature. But these kinds of maneuvers are no longer enough for Ukrainian reconnaissance systems. The operation, carried out with intelligence coordination, was executed in a three-stage plan. First, reconnaissance elements affiliated with the Black Forest Brigade clarified the coordinates of the Buck M1 through signal intersections and electro-optical analysis. Then, tactical drone systems from the Raid Battalion were directed to the identified location. In the second phase, an FPV-class attack UAV approaching the target locked onto the camouflaged Buck vehicle at an altitude of approximately 15 meters. The high-explosive penetrator warhead carried as payload was released to strike the center of the armor. After a brief silence, a violent explosion occurred as the warhead penetrated the hull. The explosive warheads of the missiles carried by the target vehicle also reacted in a chain reaction, causing a fire accompanied by intense smoke and heat that enveloped the area. Within a short time, uncontrolled flames engulfed both platforms of the vehicle, rendering it completely unusable. The European Union's 18th sanctions package against Russia has moved beyond the draft stage and is now being finalized down to the last comma on the desks of member capitals. It has become clear that Brussels is witnessing an economic blockade of unprecedented scale and depth in its history. The gradual restrictions that began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 had hardened into an oil embargo, technology controls, financial blockades, and price caps following the full-scale invasion of 2022. However, the new blow to the energy lifeline, combined with the double clamp on banking communications and the port ban leaving the shadow fleet uninsured, has brought us to a turning point where the foreign exchange taps feeding the Kremlin's war machine will be shut off to the bone. Brussels' diplomatic records indicate that the package includes freezing all payments related to engineering, maintenance, decommissioning, and even environmental liability insurance for the Nord Stream 1-2 pipelines. They also included elements such as lowering the $60 per barrel cap on Russian oil to $45, and banning a total of 419 ships, including 77 newly built tankers, from entering EU waters, financial and insurance pools, and port infrastructure. It was also mentioned that the interest income from Russia's frozen reserves would be transferred to the Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, effectively halting the financial pumping of the war through Russian assets. Now we will take a closer look at how the EU's new sanctions package against Russia will affect Putin and his country. Before we begin, please subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and turn on notifications. First, let's recall the previous restrictions that preceded the new sanctions package. In the first 17 packages, technology export controls reduced the flow of semiconductors, CNC machines, and avionics components by 90%. The number of banks removed from SWIFT increased from 7 to 13. The number of individuals and companies added to the blacklist rose from 1,440 to 2,250, and Russian-flagged ships docking at ports were banned from unloading cargo except for grain and fertilizer. Additionally, Russia's industrial software updates have been halted, aviation spare parts supply has been reduced to zero, and the depletion of spare engines, tires, and electronic components in Russia's civil aviation sector has left a third of Aeroflot's fleet grounded. Due to chip restrictions, Uralvagonzavod could no longer obtain Soviet-era turret computers. Now the financial noose has tightened further, cutting off 22 banks that continue to operate through convoluted correspondent accounts via Belgrade, Bishkek, Dubai, making the ruble dependent on internal reserve funds. This is because the EU's new legal framework is deterring Moscow from conducting euro transactions with third country banks by threatening to freeze their assets. The contraction in the energy sector is even more dramatic. A $45 price cap will deepen Russia's discount on Urals, crude double tanker freight rates due to an uninsured shadow fleet, and push actual sales revenue below the critical threshold of $50 for budget balance, leaving the federal treasury facing reserve depletion. If Brent prices hover between $55 and $60 amid fears of a recession, Russian oil will be sold at $35 to $40, causing the liquid assets of the National Welfare Fund, which has been eroding at a rate of 3% to 4% annually for 3 consecutive years, to drop below $10 billion by mid-2026. The Finance Ministry will already be forced to pay interest rates close to 15% in the domestic bond market, where it has issued bonds. While banking restrictions dealt a blow to the war economy, technology restrictions made machines from Silicon Valley, ASML, Tokyo Electron, and Atlas Copco inaccessible, and even parallel imports via China were caught up in chip embargo rules, leaving Russian microelectronics companies unable to produce their own architecture. The EU's new package includes an additional technology clause that adds dual-use components, such as gas turbine control units, automotive ECUs, drone gyroscopes, and inertial measurement units, IMUs, to a broadly defined customs tariff code, effectively closing the Belarus-Kazakhstan transit routes. The Eurostat protocol, which detected that laser-cutting machines declared from Germany to Kazakhstan for temporary storage were actually being transferred to Russia, is now revoking those storage permits. Domestically, this pressure will create a black hole in Putin's fiscal equation, which has already pushed military spending to a record 7% of GDP. When wage and social security payments face default risk, the Kremlin will either print rubles to keep inflation permanently in double digits, or cut spending, both of which will undermine war capacity. Meanwhile, the new sanctions package is likely to anger Russians considerably.
The heart of Russia, Moscow, was plunged into darkness overnight. The deafening roars piercing the sky sent shivers down the spines of civilians. Exactly 93 unmanned aerial vehicles breached the air defense system that the Kremlin had declared untouchable for years. 354 flights were cancelled, leaving thousands of passengers stranded at airports. In this video, we will not only examine the aftermath of this attack, but also delve into how Russia's aviation system collapsed, how air superiority shifted in favor of Ukraine over Moscow's skies, and the global implications of this event for civil aviation. Sit back, because this is not just a drone attack, it is the collapse of Russia's myth of invincibility in the skies. Moscow's airspace had been touted as a closed circuit for years. With S-400 batteries, Pantsir turrets, and massive radar domes, it was said that objects smaller than a few centimeters in diameter couldn't even get close to Russia's capital. But on July 19th, the city's sky awoke to a completely different scene. Days passed, but the scene remained unchanged. 93 unmanned aerial vehicles, each carrying several hundred grams of explosives in their tiny carbon fiber bodies, entered the capital's surroundings simultaneously, targeting runway lights, radar towers, and communication panels on the roofs of data centers. On that shocking night, a total of 354 scheduled flights were cancelled, and over 200 flights were diverted to emergency routes. Sheremetyevo, Vnukovo, and Domodedovo airports were placed under quarantine. Passengers waiting in the domestic terminal first heard the quarantine announcement, then saw staff rushing around in panic. The scene at all 3 airports was the same. Passport counters closed. People waiting for receipts at duty-free counters began wrapping their luggage and searching for seats. Within an hour, thousands of families loaded their backpacks onto luggage carts and sat on the carpet. Even the foldable beds distributed urgently in some areas were insufficient. The helplessness and anger of families trying to protect their children as they queued outside the restrooms were evident in their eyes. Children were given military-style camouflage blankets. These were normally kept in military emergency warehouses. In other words, a civilian infrastructure disaster scenario was being implemented for the first time. But the story is not just about people lying on the ground at airports. This was the moment that declared the most dangerous face of modern warfare. The civilian airspace, the daily lives of ordinary people, had now become a battlefield. The fact that one of the world's most heavily defended capitals, like Moscow, could be silenced so easily by drones was a complete fiasco. That night, a wave of unmanned aerial vehicles first passed over radar stations in the Tula region. They then crossed the skies of Kaluga and headed southeast toward Moscow. Drones coming from the west slightly shifted their course northward as the city lights of the capital appeared on the horizon, approaching communication cabins around Sheremetyevo. The eastern flank simultaneously circled around Vladimir and reached the southern antenna field of the Domodedovo runways. The southwestern wing carried an electronic jamming capsule originating from Tula, opened its orbit in the air, and flooded the data communication centers with ghost signals. Each of these routes was within the Russian integrated air defense layer. This means that there was either a blind spot in the radar communications chain or a shortage of personnel. The shortage of specialists is growing every month. Hundreds of thousands of young educated people have left the country out of fear of mobilization. The number of graduates from air defense schools has fallen, and the number of officers on field duty has decreased. This information is not mentioned in government statements, but becomes evident on the ground. When manual intervention is required against a drone swarm, an operator clicking on a target box on the screen could miss the drone instead of the aircraft due to a few seconds of delay. The reports from that night included the phrase, "tower communication saturation." This indicates that the system was operating beyond its capacity. For these reasons, pilots were unable to communicate with the tower. Radar systems were temporarily disabled, and a fire hazard developed on the runway. Here, we see that synchronization is prioritized over speed. These vehicles approach their targets at 100 kilometers per hour, not 500 kilometers per hour. However, when they all touch different points at the same second, the defense network suddenly becomes vulnerable. Thoughtful, what was the cause of this vulnerability in the defense network? Why were the much-praised Russian air defense systems insufficient? The S-400 Triumph air defense system was originally designed to target large radar signal-intensive targets. Its purpose was to act as a zone shield, capable of detecting and striking large objects such as ballistic missiles and fighter jets from 400 kilometers away. The radars used by the system operate on wide wavelengths and are primarily calibrated to detect metal surfaces the size of square meters. However, the problem is that today's carbon fiber-bodied, 20 to 25 centimeters diameter small unmanned aerial vehicles are virtually invisible to these radars. This is because such drones typically appear on radar screens as small signals resembling atmospheric interference. The S-400 theoretically has the capability to track these small targets more closely, but then, larger threats, like cruise missiles, approaching from a distance could go unnoticed. In short, because the system is calibrated according to the catch the big target first logic, small UAVs arriving in swarms can bypass this filtering and reach the heart of Moscow. Pantsir S-1 was designed to catch low-altitude targets that the S-400 misses. But there are two major problems. The tracking system relies on human eyesight. It is difficult to spot small drone silhouettes at night. When 7-8 targets arrive at the same time, the operator cannot keep up. The radar has a narrow angle. It sees clearly at close range because it operates in the X-band, but it is slow when scanning drone swarms spread over a wide area. When the radar turns in one direction, the other sides are left exposed. Moreover, the Pantsir lacks advanced swarm tracking software. The automatic target classification capability found in Ukraine's TB2s is not yet available in Russian systems. This leaves the Pantsir vulnerable to swarm attacks. The issue of defensive shifts also stems from this. Since 2022, the air defense ring around Moscow has been redeployed twice. As the threat of Ukrainian-made glide bombs grew, the Kremlin withdrew some of the batteries to the Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk front lines. This reduced the density around the capital. The circular corridor of defense became weaker. The batteries that were moved were replaced by old S-300V combined divisions that had supposedly undergone repairs, but the semiconductor components of these systems are not compatible with modern mini-drone targeting logic. Moscow's defense was a fortress built on the logic of large targets, high radar signatures, and long ranges. The swarm of UAVs, like ants gnawing at a lion, blinded the radar. The Pantsir guns could not distinguish targets, hesitated to fire their expensive missiles, and the few missiles they did fire nullified the cumulative cost advantage in favor of the attacker.